Graham Calloway pointed at her from across the ballroom like she was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. There she is. His voice cut through the music, through the clinking glasses, through 43 conversations happening at once. My ex-wife finally decided to show up. The room went quiet, the way rooms only go quiet when something ugly is about to happen. Lillian Whitmore stood 6 feet inside the door, still holding the wrapped gift she'd brought for her cousin, her fingers pressing into the ribbon so hard her knuckles had gone white. She hadn't even had time to find a seat. She hadn't even put the gift down. Graham smiled the way he always smiled when he thought he had the room. Still unmarried? He tilted his head. I told you. I told everyone. No successful man would ever choose her. Laughter moved through the crowd in waves. If you have ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely alone, if you have ever had someone use your worst moments as entertainment, then you already know exactly what Lillian felt in that moment. But you don't know what happened next. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this one moves you, give it a like. It takes 2 seconds, and it means everything. Now, let's go back to that ballroom. Lillian Whitmore was 41 years old and had spent the last 4 years putting herself back together, one careful piece at a time. She wasn't dramatic about it. That was the thing people who knew her, before the divorce, didn't quite understand. They expected her to fall apart publicly, to cry at dinner parties, to post bitter things online at midnight. She didn't do any of that. Instead, she went back to teaching. She kept her apartment in Brooklyn, small and clean. She called her mother on Sundays. She learned how to cook things she actually liked, instead of things Graham preferred. She built a quiet life, and she was, if she was being completely honest with herself, mostly okay. Mostly. There were still mornings when she caught her reflection and heard his voice in her head before she heard her own. There were still nights when she replayed arguments from 7 years of marriage and tried to figure out where exactly things had gone wrong, which was a dangerous game, because Graham had been very good at making sure the answer always seemed to be her. She almost didn't come to the engagement party. Her cousin Caroline had called 3 times. Caroline was marrying a man named Derek, and the party was being held at the Meridian, one of those Manhattan hotels where the chandeliers cost more than most Bible steasting. Lillian liked Caroline. She genuinely did. But she also knew that Graham and Caroline had stayed loosely connected through mutual friends, which meant there was a chance he'd be there. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was past it. She put on the emerald green dress she'd bought for a different occasion 2 years ago and never worn. She did her makeup the way she'd learned to do it after the divorce, clean and precise, and entirely for herself. And she took the subway instead of a cab because she'd been trying to save money, and also because standing on a train platform for 20 minutes gave her time to remind herself that Graham Calloway was a chapter that was finished. The ballroom was already full when she arrived. That was her first mistake. She should have come earlier, when she could have found Caroline, found a corner, found her bearings. Instead, she walked in late, and the crowd parted slightly the way crowds do, and Graham saw her before she saw him. He had a champagne glass in one hand and his arm around a woman Lillian didn't recognize, young, very pretty, wearing something that probably cost more than Lillian's monthly rent. He looked exactly the way he always looked. Expensive, confident, like the world had been arranged specifically around his comfort. She saw him the moment he pointed, and she thought very clearly and very calmly, I should have taken a cab. There she is. The voice hit the room like a stone hitting still water. My ex-wife finally decided to show up. 40-something conversations stopped. Lillian stood completely still. She was still holding the gift. That was the detail that stayed with her later. The absurdity of standing there with a ribbon-wrapped box in her hands while Graham Calloway destroyed the air around her. He was already moving, angling his body toward the center of the room, the way he always did when he was about to perform. Graham Calloway had always been a performer. She'd found it charming once. 7 years and a divorce later, she recognized it for what it was. Look at that dress, he said, not loudly enough to be obvious, but loudly enough that the people around him could hear every word clearly. She was always so careful with money, even when I was giving her plenty of it. He smiled. Old habits. Someone laughed. Lillian couldn't see who. She didn't look. She was doing a calculation in her head. The door was behind her. Caroline was somewhere on the far side of the room. The gift table was to her left. She could put down the gift and leave. She could walk out right now, and Graham would say something about that too. But at least he'd be saying it to her back. She put the gift down, but she didn't leave. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was 4 years of carefully rebuilt dignity that wouldn't let her walk out the door. Maybe it was something simpler, the fact that she was tired. Not sleepy, the other kind of tired. The kind that had been building for years and finally settled somewhere behind her sternum. Graham kept talking. Her teaching career, he said, like the words themselves were the punchline. She gave up a perfectly good marketing position to go back to a classroom. For the money, another beat, another smile. What? For the fulfillment, she used to say. The way he said fulfillment made it sound like a disease. Lillian looked at him, really looked at him, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in years. He was wearing a suit that fit perfectly. His hair was cut the way it always was. He looked completely comfortable destroying her in public, which told her something she'd always known, but never quite let herself name out loud. He wasn't doing this because she'd hurt him. He was doing this because he could. I tried to tell her, Graham continued, and now he was speaking to the room at large, to the gathered guests at his girlfriend's side and his colleagues' sides, and the strangers who just happened to be standing close enough to hear. I tried to tell her that a certain kind of woman makes it very hard for a man to stay. Lillian's fingers tightened around her purse strap. A certain kind of woman. She knew that phrase. She'd heard it in different forms for 7 years. You're too sensitive. You ask too many questions. You make everything harder than it has to be. By the end of their marriage, Lillian had started to believe it. That was the part she never told anyone, not her mother, not Caroline, not the therapist she saw for 14 months after the divorce. She'd started to think he was right, that there was something in her that was specifically, uniquely difficult to love. Graham delivered the final line like he'd been saving it. I told her no successful man would ever choose her, and there it was. The room did something interesting then. Not everyone laughed. Some people looked away. Some people studied their drinks. A woman near the back of the room put her hand over her mouth. But enough people laughed that the sound filled the space, and Graham's smile widened, and Lillian understood that this was the moment. This was the moment she either became a story. Graham told for the rest of his life, remember that engagement party. Remember how she just stood there or she didn't. She let out a slow breath, Graham. Her voice was steady, not loud. She didn't need it to be loud. The room was already quiet. Our marriage didn't end because I wasn't good enough. He started to say something. She kept going. It ended because you stopped respecting me, long before you stopped loving me. And I stayed for 2 years after I should have left, because you were very good at making me think that was my fault. She paused. It wasn't. Graham's smile flickered. So say whatever you want tonight, Lillian said. But know that you lost the right to define me when you signed those papers. I've been a lot of things since then. Confused. Sad. Angry. She tilted her head slightly. But chosen? That was never your call to make. She turned toward the door. She was going to leave. She'd decided. She'd said what she needed to say, and she was going to walk out with her head up and cry in the cab on the way home, and that would be the end of it. Then a voice came from the entrance. I was wondering how long it would take before somebody embarrassed himself. The voice was quiet. That was what Lillian noticed first. In a room that had gone very still, the voice didn't need to be anything other than what it was: calm, low, completely certain of itself. She turned. A man was standing in the ballroom entrance. He was tall, not in the exaggerated way of men who want you to notice their height, but in the way of a person who takes up exactly the space they're entitled to. Dark suit, perfectly fitted, the kind of clothes that don't announce themselves. Dark hair with a few threads of gray at the temples. He was somewhere around 40. And he had the kind of face that had clearly been through things and come out the other side without particularly softening. He wasn't looking at Graham. He was looking at Lillian. He walked toward her. There was something about the way the crowd shifted as he moved, not dramatically, not in a panic, but the way people shift around someone they instinctively recognize as significant. Lillian noticed it without quite registering what it meant. He was carrying a small velvet box. He stopped in front of her. She stared at him. Up close, his eyes were dark gray, And he looked at her the way very few people looked at her directly, without apology, like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at. "You forgot something," he said quietly. He opened the box. Inside was a ring. Platinum. Simple. Clean, not showy, not enormous. The kind of ring someone chose because they meant it rather than because they wanted it noticed. He took her left hand. He slid the ring onto her finger. His hands were warm. Lillian's mind did something strange in that moment. It went completely, utterly blank. 7 years of marriage to Graham, 4 years of rebuilding herself, all of it just stopped. There was only the weight of the ring and the man standing in front of her, and the room full of people who had gone so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. He turned toward Graham. "My name is Roman Blackwood." He said it the way other men said nothing, flatly, without inflection, like it was simply information. "And Lillian Whitmore Blackwood is my wife." The sound of breaking glass. Graham's champagne flute had slipped from his fingers. It shattered against the marble floor in a small, bright explosion that nobody moved to clean up, because nobody moved at all. Lillian looked at Graham's face. She had seen Graham Calloway angry. She had seen him smug. She had seen him cold and calculating, and occasionally in their early years, genuinely joyful. She had never seen him look the way he looked right now, like a man who has suddenly discovered that the ground he was standing on had been hollow the entire time. Roman didn't wait for a response. He offered Lillian his arm. She took it not because she needed to, not because she was incapable of standing on her own, but because something in her body made the decision before her brain caught up. His arm was solid under her hand. She was aware of the ring on her finger, the unfamiliar weight of it, the way it caught the chandelier light as they moved. They walked toward the terrace doors. Behind them, the room exploded. Lillian heard fragments, voices overlapping. Caroline saying something high-pitched and startled. A man near the bar saying Roman Blackwood in a tone that sounded like someone swallowing wrong. She didn't look back. The terrace was cool and dark above the city. Manhattan spread below them in its usual indifferent glitter. Roman stood at the railing and said nothing for a moment. Lillian looked at the ring on her hand. Her hand was shaking slightly. She hadn't noticed until now. "I owe you an explanation," Roman said. "Several," she agreed. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it. "Caroline called me," he said. "She was worried about you coming tonight. She'd heard Graham was going to be there." He paused. "And I had my own reasons for wanting to be in that room." Lillian turned to look at him. In the darkness, away from the crowd, he looked different. Still exactly what he was. She could feel the authority of him, the weight of whatever it was that made a room shift when he walked into it, but also something else. Something more careful. "Who are you?" she asked. It wasn't a naive question. She understood distantly that the name Roman Blackwood meant something. She could tell by the way the crowd had reacted, by the way even Graham had looked unsteady for a moment. She just didn't know the details yet. And she had learned, in 4 years of rebuilding herself, that she needed the details. Roman was quiet for a moment. "Complicated," he said finally. "I've had a complicated night," Lillian said. "Try anyway." He looked at her, then a look she wouldn't fully understand until later, until she knew him better. At the time, it just seemed like a man deciding something. "I run several businesses," he said. "Financial, real estate, private investments. Some of what I do is straightforward." A pause. "Some of it isn't." Lillian waited. "Your ex-husband," Roman said, "has been involved with one of my organizations for about 18 months. He runs the financial side of a subsidiary company." He stopped, chose his next words carefully. Or he did, until certain irregularities were discovered. The air on the terrace shifted. Lillian felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear, exactly. More like the sensation of a room coming into focus, like she'd been standing in a space she thought she understood, and someone had just turned on a light, and the room was larger than she'd realized. "What kind of irregularities?" she said. Roman looked at her steadily. "The kind," he said, "that will take some time to explain, and some time to resolve." He glanced back at the ballroom doors. "Tonight was not the place for that conversation. But you came tonight anyway." "Yes, because of me." He was quiet for a moment. "Because of you," he said. "And because I had been waiting for the right moment to introduce myself to Graham Calloway, in a context he wouldn't forget." Lillian looked at the ring on her finger again. The weight of it, The impossible, absurd reality of standing on a hotel terrace in Manhattan with a stranger's ring on her hand, while her ex-husband stood 40 feet away in pieces. "We're not actually married," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Roman said. He didn't apologize for it, which she found, strangely, more reassuring than if he had. "But the ring is real. And everything else I said in there," he glanced toward the doors. "That was real too." She looked at him. "You don't know me," she said. "I know more than you think," he said. "Your cousin talks about you a great deal, and I had some additional context." He paused. "The literacy fundraiser. October, 3 years ago. You challenged the keynote speaker about the allocation of funds for underserved school programs." Lillian stared at him. "That was you," she said slowly. "You or she stopped." She remembered that event. She remembered a man in a dark suit who hadn't introduced himself, who'd listened to her argument with an attention that had startled her, who'd asked 2 very precise questions, and then said he'd look into it. She'd assumed he was a foundation board member. "You followed up," she heard herself say. "The next month, that school got its funding restored." "They deserved it," Roman said simply. Lillian was quiet for a long time. Below them, Manhattan continued its indifferent, glittering life. Behind them, through the closed terrace doors, she could hear the low roar of the party reconstituting itself, conversation starting again, music resuming, the sound of people processing what they'd witnessed and deciding what story to tell about it. Her hand had stopped shaking. She looked at the ring. It was a real ring, not costume jewelry, not a prop. Somebody had chosen it carefully, the weight and the simplicity of it, the way it fit her finger precisely, which meant somebody had known her ring size, which was a thought she didn't quite want to follow to its end yet. "You planned this," she said. "Parts of it. The ring. Yes. The timing. Mostly." She exhaled. "Graham used to say I was impossible," she said. The words came out flat, factual, like she was reading them from a page. "That I made everything harder than it needed to be. That I analyzed things to death." She paused. "I'm realizing he may have had a point." Roman looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "He had an interest in making you believe that. There's a difference." The terrace doors opened. Caroline appeared, slightly breathless, her engagement party half forgotten behind her. "Lillian," she said. "Oh my God, Lillian, are you?" She stopped when she saw Roman. Something moved across her face. Something complicated and layered, like a person who had made a plan and was now watching it arrive in real life and was slightly overwhelmed by the actuality of it. "You came," Caroline said to Roman. "You asked me to," he said. Caroline looked at Lillian, then at the ring on Lillian's hand, then back at Lillian. "I'm sorry," Caroline said. "I should have warned you. I didn't know how, and I thought I know," Lillian said. Inside the ballroom, through the glass, she could see Graham standing in the middle of the room. His champagne glass was still in pieces on the floor. The woman he'd arrived with, the one who'd been at his side when he pointed, was no longer standing beside him. She was across the room, talking to another woman, her back deliberately turned. Lillian watched Graham scan the crowd for an ally. Find none. He was a man who had spent years building a life on the certainty that he was the one people chose. He was looking at a room full of people who were actively not choosing him, and the expression on his face was something she would think about for a long time afterward, not with satisfaction, not with cruelty, but with the strange, specific recognition of someone seeing a thing she had always suspected confirmed. Graham had never believed his own warnings about her. He'd just used them to make her smaller. Roman said something quietly to Caroline, who nodded and went back inside, pulling the terrace door mostly shut behind her. Lillian stood with the ring on her finger, and the city below her, and the strangest night of her adult life still unspooling, and she thought about the question Graham had asked the room to answer for him. No successful man would ever choose her. She looked at Roman Blackwood. He wasn't looking at the city. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at her with the same direct, not like green, unapologetic attention he'd had since the moment he walked into the ballroom, like she was the only thing in the room worth looking at, and the room happened to be the world. She didn't know yet who he really was. She didn't know yet what Graham had done, or what it meant, or where any of this was going to end. But she knew one thing. She was still standing, and for tonight, standing was enough. The terrace door opened again, and this time it wasn't Caroline. It was Graham. He stepped outside with the particular energy of a man who had spent 10 minutes in a room full of people who wouldn't quite meet his eyes, and had decided that confrontation was better than humiliation. He'd straightened his jacket. He was holding a fresh glass of champagne, which meant he'd stopped at the bar on the way out, which meant he'd needed a moment to collect himself, which told Lillian everything she needed to know about how rattled he actually was beneath the performance. He looked at Lillian first, then at Roman, then at the ring on Lillian's hand, which caught the light from the doorway in a way that made it impossible to miss. "I want to talk," Graham said. He was using the voice she recognized, controlled, reasonable sounding, the voice he used when he wanted to appear like the calm one in the room. "You talked plenty inside," Lillian said. Graham ignored her. He looked at Roman, alone. Roman didn't move. He didn't shift his weight or cross his arms or do any of the things men did when they were preparing for a confrontation. He just stood there in the same quiet way he'd stood since they'd come outside, and said, "No." One word. No explanation attached to it. Graham's jaw tightened. "I don't know what she told you about our marriage." "She didn't tell me anything tonight," Roman said. "We've been standing on this terrace for the same amount of time you've been standing in that ballroom trying to decide whether to come out here." A beat. Graham looked at Lillian. "This is a performance. You know that, right? Whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at Roman, at the ring, at the general situation. "He's doing this to get at me. Whatever he told you, whatever he offered you." Graham, Lillian's voice was very even. "Stop. I'm serious, Lillian. You don't know who this man is. And you do?" The question landed in a way Graham hadn't expected. She could see it, the slight hesitation, the recalibration. He recovered quickly, the way he always did, but she'd spent 7 years learning the shape of his recoveries. "His name comes up in certain circles," Graham said carefully. "Business circles. He has a reputation for—" He stopped. "Chose something safer. For aggressive tactics." Roman listened to this with an expression of complete neutrality. "Is that what they're calling it?" he said. It wasn't a question. Graham looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, something Lillian couldn't quite name. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like the early stages of fear being suppressed very hard. "I just want to be clear about what's happening here," Graham said. "For Lillian's sake." "My sake," Lillian repeated. "You've been through a difficult few years, Graham." She said his name with the specific flatness of a woman who is done. "I need you to hear me say this clearly, so there's no confusion later. Whatever you're about to tell me about myself, about my judgment, or my choices, or my emotional state, I need you to know that I have already heard every version of it. You spent 7 years telling me I didn't understand things correctly, that my instincts were off, that I needed your interpretation of events to know what was actually happening." She paused. "I'm done with that. I've been done with it for 4 years. So whatever comes out of your mouth next, make sure it's something worth saying." The terrace was quiet. Below them, Manhattan moved through its Tuesday night, like none of this was happening. Graham looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face changed, the performance dropped. Just slightly, just for a second, and what was underneath it was worse than the cruelty. It was wounded pride. The specific rancid pride of a man who had genuinely believed his own version of events, and was now watching it fail to hold. "You were always going to do something like this," he said quietly. "Find someone to prove a point." "I wasn't trying to prove anything," Lillian said. "I just came to give Caroline a gift." Graham looked at Roman one more time. Then he looked at the ring. Then he turned and went back inside without another word, which was the only graceful exit available to him. And he took it, which was the first smart thing he'd done all night. The door clicked shut. Roman was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're good at that." "At what?" "Not flinching." Lillian looked at the ring on her hand. "I've had practice," she said. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The thing you said inside. About knowing something about Graham." She kept her voice steady. "How serious is it?" Roman was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted. "Serious enough," he said, "that I'd rather not discuss it on a hotel terrace. But you came tonight because of it. Partly. And partly because of me." He looked at her. "Yes." She nodded slowly. She was turning something over in her mind. Some equation she didn't have all the variables for yet. "Caroline set this up," she said. "She called you because she knew Graham would be here. She was worried about you." She's been worried about me since the divorce. She worries about me every time I leave the house. Lillian almost smiled. Caroline means well. She also has a tendency to manage situations without checking whether the situation wants to be managed. She mentioned that about herself. Actually, Roman said. Lillian looked at him. She told you she was overbearing? She told me she had a cousin who deserved better than standing alone in a room with her ex-husband. He paused. And she told me about October. The fundraiser. She didn't know we'd already met. Lillian was quiet for a moment. We didn't meet, she said. We spoke for 6 minutes, and then you disappeared. I remembered them, he said simply. Inside the ballroom, through the glass of the terrace doors, Lillian could see movement. The party had reconstituted itself the way parties do, after disruption with a kind of over-enthusiastic noise. People laughing slightly too hard, music turned up a notch to fill the silence that had opened and closed. She could see Caroline near the far wall, talking to Derek with the focused energy of someone pretending everything was fine. She could see Graham's back near the bar. She could not see the woman who'd been with Graham, the one with the expensive bracelet. She'd moved to the far side of the room after Roman appeared, and now Lillian realized she was gone entirely. His girlfriend left, Lillian said. Roman glanced through the glass. Vivian Mercer, he said. She's worked in private wealth management for 11 years. She's smart. And she's been with Graham for 8 months. Lillian stared at him. How do you know who she is? When someone has access to my organization's finances, Roman said, I make it a point to know who they spend time with. The air between them shifted. There it was, again, that sense of a room being larger than she'd thought, of revealing space she hadn't known was there. Lillian looked at this man who had put a ring on her finger in front of 40 people and spoken her name like it meant something, and she felt the full, disorienting weight of not knowing what she'd walked into. Who are you? She asked again. The same question as before, but different now. Specific, pointed. Roman looked at her for a moment. He seemed to be making a decision. Come have coffee with me tomorrow morning, he said, and I'll answer that properly. Tonight, she said. Enough to understand tonight. He nodded. A single nod. Then he said, I run businesses that operate in spaces the law doesn't always reach. I have interests in real estate, financial services, private investment, and other areas that are harder to categorize. He paused. 18 months ago, we brought your ex-husband on to manage the financial operations of a subsidiary company. He came with excellent credentials and very good references. Another pause. And he has spent the last 14 months stealing from us. The city's lights blurred slightly at the edges of Lillian's vision. She blinked. How much? She said. Enough, Roman said, that it stopped being a bookkeeping problem and became something else. Something else, she repeated. I mean that what started as an internal matter is now in the hands of people who deal with these things formally. He held her gaze. I want you to understand that nothing that happens to Graham Calloway in the coming weeks is because of tonight. The investigation was already complete. The decision was already made. Tonight he stopped. Tonight I made a personal choice that I'm aware was impulsive and I don't entirely regret. Lillian stared at him. Then, without planning to, she laughed. It surprised both of them, a short, real sound. Nothing performed about it. Roman looked at her with something that was almost surprised, almost warm, the first crack she'd seen in the careful steadiness he carried around like a second skin. Impulsive, she said. You brought a custom ring to a hotel engagement party and announced my marriage to 40 strangers, and you're calling it impulsive. I had the ring for 2 weeks, he admitted. That is not less alarming. No, he said. I know. She shook her head, looked at the ring again. I should give this back to you. You can, he said. Or you can keep it for the evening and decide, in the morning. Those aren't the only 2 options. They're the 2 I'm offering. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, steady and unhurried, like a man who was comfortable with uncertainty, in a way that most people weren't. Like a man who'd learned that waiting was a form of power, and that patience wasn't passivity. Coffee, she said. Tomorrow morning. And you answer my questions. All of them, he said. She left the ring on her finger. They went back inside. The ballroom had shifted while they were gone. The air of it, the weight of it. Lillian felt it, the moment they came through the terrace door, eyes finding her, conversations pausing, the specific attention of a room that had decided she was the most interesting thing in it. kept her face neutral and her chin level, and reminded herself that she'd stood in front of 37th graders every day for 9 months and survived that. She found Caroline near the gift table, pretending to admire the arrangements. "Lillian," Caroline said immediately, "I'm so sorry. I know I should have—" "We'll talk about it later," Lillian said. "Are you okay? It's your engagement party." Caroline looked at her like she'd said something in a language she didn't speak. "Am I okay? Lillian, Roman Blackwood just announced that you're married to him in front of everyone I know. I know what happened. I was there. Derek thinks it's the most exciting thing that's ever occurred at a party." Caroline glanced at Derek, who was across the room talking to 2 men with the bright-eyed energy of someone who'd witnessed something he couldn't wait to describe. "He's very enthusiastic." "I like Derek," Lillian said. Lillian Caroline lowered her voice. "I called Roman because I was worried. Graham told me last week that he was coming tonight, and I knew you were coming, and I knew he'd do something. I didn't know Roman would." She gestured helplessly at the ring on Lillian's hand. "Did you know about Graham?" Lillian asked quietly. "What he's been doing?" Caroline went still. "What do you mean?" Lillian studied her cousin's face. "Nothing," she said. "Never mind. We'll talk tomorrow." She moved through the party with Roman at her shoulder, not in front of her, not steering her, but present in the way that made the crowd give them space without being asked. She was aware of the shape of him beside her, aware of the ring, aware of the particular absurdity of the entire situation, which she kept having to remind herself was real. Graham was at the bar. Their eyes met once across the room. He looked away first. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to, or feared, to some version of emotion that was about Graham, that was still shaped by 7 years of marriage and 4 years of recovery. But what she actually felt was something quieter and more disorienting. She felt like herself, not the version of herself that Graham had described to her for 7 years, not the careful, slightly flattened version she'd built during the divorce to protect herself. The real version, the one who argued about education funding with strangers at charity events and meant it. The one who got on a subway alone in an emerald dress to face a room she wasn't sure she could handle. That woman had been here all along. She'd just forgotten to look for her. The party wound down slowly, the way parties do when the energy has peaked too early. Guests drifted toward the coat check. The music softened. Caroline gave a brief, emotional speech about Derek that made 3 people cry, and Derek himself looked like a man who had won something enormous, which he had. Roman stayed through the speech. He stood near the back of the room with his hands in his pockets, and the patient stillness that Lillian was beginning to recognize as simply the way he existed in spaces, taking up exactly what he needed, and nothing more. Lillian stood beside Caroline and held her hand during the speech, and told herself she would not cry, and then cried anyway. Briefly and silently, which she blamed on the evening being too much all at once. When the speech was over, Graham left. He didn't say goodbye to Caroline. He didn't look at Lillian. He simply put on his coat and moved toward the exit with the slightly compressed energy of a man containing himself very hard, and then he was gone. Vivian Mercer had been gone for an hour already. A sound like green wood splitting. Later would learn what had happened to Vivian after the ring, moment she would piece it together from Caroline, who had pieced it together from someone who'd been standing nearby. Vivienne had watched Graham across the room after Roman's announcement. She hadn't approached him immediately. She'd stood with her champagne and watched his face cycle through the reaction shock, then anger, then the performing calm that Lillian knew so well, and she'd thought about 8 months of weekends and dinners and conversations. She'd thought about the things Graham said about his ex-wife. Bitter, couldn't move on. Nobody would put up with her twice. And she'd looked at the man at the center of the room, the one whose name had made people go quiet, the one who'd walked in carrying a ring for a woman he hadn't announced. And she'd thought, Graham knew something, and he didn't tell me. She took off the bracelet by herself, near the coat check, and left it on the counter for the attendant to find. She didn't go back to say anything to Graham. There was nothing to say that the evening hadn't already said. Lillian didn't know any of this yet when she said goodnight to Caroline and stepped out of the Meridian into the Manhattan night. Roman walked beside her. His car was at the curb, a dark car, unremarkable from the outside, with a driver who didn't turn around. "I can take a cab," Lillian said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm pointing out that I'm capable of it." I know you're capable of it, Roman said. I'm pointing out that it's 11:30, and you've had a significant evening. She looked at him. Is this how you are? All the time? How am I? Reasonable, she said, in a way that's slightly hard to argue with. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Get in the car, Lillian. She got in the car. They drove through the city in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. The ring was still on her finger. She kept turning it slightly with her thumb, not anxiously, more the way you'd run your tongue over a new filling, checking the shape of something unfamiliar. The investigation, she said. Graham, when does it become public? Soon, Roman said. How soon? Maybe less. She turned the ring once more. He's going to think I was involved, that I knew, that this was... She stopped. Let him think it, Roman said. That's easy to say. It is, he agreed, but nothing that happens to Graham in the next week has anything to do with you. And anyone who looks at the evidence will see that. He paused. He did this to himself, Lillian, over 14 months, with full knowledge of what he was doing. You're not a variable in that equation. She was quiet for a moment. Then he was always good with money. Graham. It's the thing he was genuinely talented at. Numbers, structures, moving things around. She paused. I used to admire it, I know. You researched me. I researched the situation. You were part of it. That's not reassuring. No, he said. I know. I'm sorry. The car stopped outside her building in Brooklyn. She didn't ask how he knew the address. She decided to save that question for the morning. She reached for the door handle. Lillian. His voice stopped her. She looked back. Tonight, he said. What he said in there. The things he said about you. He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood the weight of them. He was wrong. Not because I'm telling you that. Because it's factually, demonstrably wrong. And the fact that you spent any time at all wondering if he was right is the only part of this evening I'm actually angry about. She held that for a moment. You don't know me well enough to say that, she said. No, he said, but I know what I've seen. And what I've seen is a woman who walked into a room she was afraid of, stood in front of a crowd that was laughing at her, said exactly the right thing, and left with her head up. He paused. Before I complicated the evening further, she almost smiled. Coffee, she said. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. I'll send you the address. I'll take a cab. She got out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk outside her building and watched the dark car pull away into the Brooklyn night, and she stood there for longer than she needed to, turning the ring on her finger in the quiet of the street, the weight of it real and strange and somehow exactly right. And she was still thinking about what he'd said. What I've seen is a woman who walked into a room she was afraid of when her phone buzzed. Text from a number she didn't have saved. 9 tomorrow. I'll text the address. And Lillian, keep the ring tonight. Was made for that hand. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she went inside. She didn't sleep well. The ring sat on her nightstand, and she kept looking at it in the dark, and she kept having the same conversation with herself in circles, who Roman Blackwood was, what he'd meant by organizations that operated in spaces the law doesn't always reach, what Graham had done with 14 months of access to money that wasn't his, and what any of it had to do with her. At 3 in the morning, she got up, made tea she didn't really want, and sat at her kitchen table. She thought about what Roman had said. He destroyed it slowly. Criticism here. A cruel joke there. 1,000 small attacks until you stopped trusting your own voice. She hadn't said that to Roman. He'd said it to her, which meant someone had Caroline, or her own face when she wasn't performing steadiness, or simply the logic of what he'd watched happen in that ballroom. However, he knew he wasn't wrong. Graham hadn't ruined her in one moment. He'd done it across 7 years of small erosions, each one small enough to dismiss, cumulative enough to flatten her. And she'd spent 4 years rebuilding something she still didn't have a complete name for. Not confidence, exactly. Not the absence of self-doubt. Something more structural than that. The knowledge that she was allowed to take up space. She was still working on it. She put the ring back on before she went back to bed. She told herself it was because she didn't want to lose it. She didn't entirely believe herself. At 8:50 the next morning, she was standing outside a building in Midtown that she would later understand was one of the Blackwood organization's legitimate fronts, a financial consulting firm on the 14th floor of a tower that looked like every other tower on the block and gave nothing away from the outside. The address had come at 7 a.m. with no additional text. The lobby was marble and clean lines and a security desk, with two men who looked up when she came in, and then, when she gave her name, relaxed in a way that told her they'd been expecting her. She rode the elevator alone. The door opened onto a reception area that was quiet and well lit, with the particular quality of a space that had been designed to make people feel that whoever they were meeting was serious. A woman at the front desk smiled and offered coffee, which Lillian accepted because she'd been awake since 3 and needed it. Roman was waiting in a corner office that looked out over the city. He was already there when she came in, jacket off, sleeves rolled, which she hadn't expected. He looked like a different kind of man from the one in the ballroom. Still exactly who he was, but without the formal armor of the previous evening. More like someone you might actually know. He poured his own coffee and gestured to a chair across the low table from his. She sat. "Ask me what you want to know," he said. She asked him 3 questions in 40 minutes. She asked him who he really was, what the organization actually was, what it actually did, and what the legal exposure was for the people inside it. She asked him how Graham had gotten in and what exactly he'd done. And she asked him why, specifically, he had gone to the trouble of finding a ring that fit her finger and deciding to put it on her hand in a hand in front of a room full of strangers when he could have simply let the investigation run its course without involving her at all. He answered all 3. The first answer took 12 minutes and confirmed most of what she'd already spied from the way the ballroom reacted to his name. The organization was real. It was powerful. It operated in gray areas that required relationships with people who were not always on the right side of the law, and Roman was its head in a way that had nothing ceremonial about it. He told her this directly, without cushioning it, which she respected more than she would have respected softening. The second answer was about Graham. 14 months. Shell companies. Fraudulent vendor contracts. Money routed through accounts that looked legitimate until you looked at them the right way, at which point they looked like exactly what they were. The numbers he named made her set down her coffee cup. Third answer was the shortest. "Because you were standing in a room full of people who were laughing at you," Roman said, "and you weren't doing anything wrong. And I've watched a lot of people make a lot of choices, and the ones that cost me sleep are the ones where I could have said something and didn't." She looked at him across the table. "That's not a complete answer," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's the honest part." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee again. "What happens to Graham?" she said. "Walk me through it. What actually happens?" Roman leaned forward slightly. He explained the process the way a man explained things who had been through it before, not with drama, not with relish, but with the specific, structured clarity of someone who understood exactly how power moved through formal channels when it was directed correctly. The evidence had been compiled. It was complete. It had already been turned over to federal investigators through the organization's legal team, carefully packaged to ensure that what came out of the process served the law rather than Roman's personal interests. He'd been deliberate about that separation. He told her so directly. "I need you to understand," he said, "that nothing happening to him is about last night, or about you. If he had never humiliated you in that ballroom, the investigation would have proceeded exactly the same way." "I believe you," Lillian said, but... She set down the cup. "But I need to know that when this becomes public, when Graham's name is in the news, when people start asking questions, that there's no version of the story where I look like I was involved. Or like I knew," she paused, "because I didn't know. And I won't spend another 4 years rebuilding something because my name got attached to someone else's mess." Roman was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have attorneys who are very good at what they do. And the paper trail is very clear about what Graham did and who he did it to." He held her gaze. "Your name is nowhere in it, and it won't be." She nodded. She believed him, which was its own complicated thing, believing a man she'd known for less than 12 hours, who ran an organization that existed in the spaces the law didn't reach, who had put a custom ring on her finger at a party and called it impulsive. She believed him anyway. She stood to leave. Lillian. He stood too. "I want to ask you something." She waited. "The fundraiser," he said, 3 years ago. After you challenged the speaker, you said that the city's most underfunded schools were being passed over in favor of institutions that already had resources. You had specific data, you'd done the work. I taught in two of those schools, she said. It wasn't abstract. I know. He paused. The organization has a foundation. A legitimate one, separate from everything else. Cleanly structured. It funds adult literacy programs, workforce development, some school initiatives in underserved neighborhoods. He stopped. I'd like you to look at what we're doing and tell me where we're getting it wrong. She stared at him. You want me to consult on your foundation? Yes. After knowing me she checked her watch. 14 hours. I've been thinking about it for 3 years, he said simply. She stood in the morning light of his office window and looked at this man who had arrived in her life like a controlled explosion. Precise, devastating, leaving the landscape fundamentally altered. And she tried to locate the version of herself that would have said no thank you and gone back to Brooklyn and her small, clean apartment and her careful, quiet life. She couldn't quite find her. I'll think about it, she said. She left. She was in the elevator when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. A man's voice she didn't recognize, clipped and cold. Ms. Whitmore. My name is Daniel Price. I'm an attorney representing Graham Calloway. I understand you spent last evening in the company of Roman Blackwood. A pause. And I need you to understand that if you provide any information to Blackwood's legal team or his investigators about your ex-husband's financial activities, we will be forced to include you in certain proceedings as a person of interest. Lillian stood very still in the elevator. The doors opened on the lobby. I don't have any information, she said. That may be, Price said. But Mr. Calloway believes differently, and Mr. Calloway has a very detailed memory of conversations that took place during your marriage. The lobby was marble and clean lines and two men at the security desk who looked up when she stepped out of the elevator. Then Mr. Calloway should speak to his attorneys, Lillian said, and his attorneys should speak to mine. A pause. And everyone should be very careful about what they decide to remember. She ended the call. She stood in the lobby for 10 seconds. Then she turned around, walked back to the elevator, pressed 14, and rode back up to Roman Blackwood's office. He was still standing where she'd left him. Graham's attorney just called me, she said. Someone named Daniel Price. He implied that if I cooperate with your legal team, they'll name me as a person of interest in Graham's proceedings. Roman went very still. Not the patient stillness she'd seen before. Something different. Something with an edge to it. Say that again, he said. She said it again. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said 2 words to the room in general, quiet and completely flat. Close door. His assistant, who had appeared in the doorway without Lillian noticing, pulled it shut. Roman picked up his phone. Daniel Price just contacted my wife, he said into it. Find out who authorized that call. He lowered the phone. Looked at Lillian. Sit down, he said. His voice had changed. Not toward her. It wasn't cold toward her. It was cold the way a room gets cold when a window opens onto winter. She sat because the morning had just turned into something else, and she understood, clearly and without drama, that the point at which she could have walked away from any of this had passed sometime in the last 30 seconds. She sat. He looked at her. Graham knows something he shouldn't know, Roman said quietly. About the timing of the investigation. About who's involved. He paused. Which means someone inside my organization told him. The room was very quiet, and that, Roman said, changes everything. Roman didn't pace. That was the first thing Lillian noticed about him. When things got serious, he went completely still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. He stood at the window of his office, with his phone in his hand, and his back partially to her, and she could see the line of his shoulders and the particular quality of his stillness, and she understood, without needing it, explained, that she was watching a man contain something very large, very carefully. Assistant had closed the door. The office was quiet, in the way of rooms where important things were about to happen. Roman made 3 calls in 7 minutes. He didn't put the phone on speaker. He kept his voice low, and she caught fragments of names she didn't recognize, a date, the phrase full internal audit, spoken with the flatness of a man giving an order he knew would be obeyed. When he finished the 3rd call, he set the phone on the desk and turned around. How did Price get your number, he said. It wasn't a question directed at her. Exactly. More like a man thinking out loud in a way that required another person in the room to witness it. I don't know, Lillian said. I've never heard of Daniel Price. He's been Graham's personal attorney for 4 years, Roman said. He handles private matters. Not corporate, not litigation private. Kind of things you don't want attached to public filings. He paused. The fact that he called you, he checked his watch. 40 minutes of you. Leaving this building means someone told Graham you were here. Lillian felt the cold move through her again. The same as the night before on the terrace. You think someone in your office? I think someone in this building made a phone call. They shouldn't have, Roman said. Yes. She looked around the office. The clean lines of it. The window overlooking Midtown. The assistant who had appeared and disappeared so smoothly she'd barely registered him. The 2 men in the lobby, who had known her name before she gave it. How many people knew I was coming here this morning, she said. Roman looked at her with something that might have been respect, the specific kind that comes from someone asking the right question. 3, he said. Besides me. He moved to his desk and pressed the intercom. Get me Carter. Now. He sat down across from her at the low table, forearms on his knees, and for the first time since she'd walked back into the office, he looked at her directly with the full weight of his attention. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Not because I doubt you, because the answer matters. Ask, she said. During your marriage, did Graham ever talk about his work in a specific way? Not the general career talk specific. Numbers, structures, names of companies you didn't recognize. Lillian thought about it. 7 years of dinners and Sunday mornings and arguments in the kitchen. Graham talking about work the way Graham talked about everything. Like he was the most interesting person in the room, and the topic of himself never got old. He talked about his clients sometimes, she said slowly. He was proud of the complexity. He'd explain things to me and I'd listen, and I think he liked that I didn't always follow. It made him feel. She stopped. He liked being the one who understood things. Did he ever mention moving money through structures that seemed unusual to you? Multiple companies, accounts in different names. Graham's entire professional life involved moving money through complex structures. Lillian said, That's what he did. I wouldn't have known what was unusual. Roman nodded. He'd expected that answer. After the divorce, he said, Did he ever contact you about financial matters? Try to access joint accounts. Ask questions about records. We had attorneys for all of that, Lillian said. We didn't speak directly after the first 3 months. A knock at the door. Roman said, Come in, and the door opened. The man who entered was somewhere around 50 heavyset, with the kind of face that had seen too many early mornings and not enough good news. He was dressed well, but not formally. Jacket, but no tie. The look of a man whose job required him to move between different kinds of rooms. He stopped when he saw Lillian. You wanted me, he said to Roman. Not a question. Sit down, Carter. Carter sat in the chair beside Lillian. He didn't look at her again. He looked at Roman, with the expression of a man who already knew something was wrong and was deciding how much he already knew showed on his face. Daniel Price called Ms. Whitmore 40 minutes ago, Roman said. He knew she'd been in this building. Carter's expression didn't change. That was telling. Most people, when they heard something unexpected, reacted to the unexpectedness first before they reacted to the content. Carter's went straight to the content. That shouldn't have happened, Carter said. No, Roman said. It shouldn't have. So I'm asking you to help me understand how it did. Carter shifted in his chair, a small movement, the adjustment of a man who was physically uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the furniture. I'll need to look into it, he said. You'll do that, Roman said. And while you're doing that, I want you to think very carefully about whether there's something you want to tell me before I find it myself. He paused. Because I will find it. And the version of this conversation that happens after I find it is considerably less comfortable than this one. The room was very quiet. Carter looked at Roman for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation, a decision being made and unmade and made again. I made a call, Carter said finally. Last night. After the party. Roman didn't move. I called a contact, Carter said. To give them a heads up, it was. I thought it was a professional courtesy. The situation had gotten complicated, and I thought, who, Roman said. One word, completely flat. Carter's jaw tightened. Marcus Webb. The name meant nothing to Lillian, but she watched Roman's face, and she saw something happen there that she hadn't seen before, a contraction. Subtle and total, like a fist closing inside very controlled skin. Leave, Roman said. Carter stood up. He looked like a man who had just aged 5 years in 30 seconds. Roman, I want to explain. Get out of my office, Roman said. Same tone. Completely level. And don't make any more calls. Carter left. The door closed. Lillian waited. Marcus Webb, she said carefully. Roman was looking at the middle distance. Webb is one of 3 men who sit on the board of the organization's financial oversight structure, he said. He spoke slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone choosing exactly how much to say. He has known about the Graham investigation for 6 months. He approved the decision to proceed. He stopped. He also has a partnership interest in 2 of the shell companies Graham was routing money through. Lillian stared at him. He's been stealing from you too, she said. Not from me, Roman said. From the same pool Graham was stealing from, which means they weren't operating independently. He looked at her now, and his eyes were very dark and completely clear. Graham Calloway was not the primary actor in this scheme. He was working with someone on the inside, someone who gave him access, gave him the structures, gave him the cover. Marcus Webb, Lillian said. That's what I need to confirm, Roman said. But yes. She sat with that for a moment. The shape of it. The architecture of what had apparently been happening, not a rogue employee running a scheme from the outside, but something that started from the inside and reached out to use Graham as its instrument. The evidence you turned over to the federal investigators, she said slowly. How much of it implicates Webb? Roman looked at her steadily. That depends on what Carter told Webb last night, and what Webb did with 6 hours of knowing the net was tightening. He could have moved things, Lillian said. Accounts, records, destroyed. Yes, Roman said. So the case against Graham may now be missing pieces that someone spent the night removing. He stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to her, and both hands in his pockets, and she watched the set of his shoulders still. So still, but different from the stillness before. This was the stillness of a man holding something volatile. How bad, she said. I don't know yet. He turned around. But I need to know, and I need to know today, and in the meantime, I need you to stay away from your apartment. She blinked. What? Price's call was a warning, Roman said. He was telling you that if you get involved, there are consequences. But the fact that they made that call at all tells me they're worried. And worried people do things that go beyond calls from attorneys. The air in the room changed again. Lillian looked at him. She was doing the same calculation she'd been doing since the elevator, measuring the distance between what she understood and what she needed to understand, checking her own reactions against the reality of the situation rather than against the fear of it. You're telling me I might be in danger, she said. I'm telling you I don't want to find out the hard way, Roman said. There's a difference. There's not much of a difference from where I'm sitting. No, he said, I know. She was quiet for a moment. Then I have a classroom full of students tomorrow morning. I know. I have a townhouse 4 blocks from here, Roman said. Guest floor. You have complete autonomy, come and go as you need to. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to not be alone until I know how far this has spread. He paused. 1 day. Maybe 2. She looked at him for a long time. This is not the coffee meeting I was expecting, she said. No, he said. It isn't. She thought about her apartment in Brooklyn. Small and clean, the way she'd made it. The kitchen table, where she sat at 3 in the morning, drinking tea she didn't want. The life she'd built carefully, one chosen piece at a time. 1 day, she said. 1 day, he agreed. She called the school from the car and arranged a substitute. She didn't explain. She said there was a family situation, which felt true enough that she could say it, without her voice doing anything wrong. The vice principal was understanding. The car moved through midtown traffic while Roman sat beside her and made calls she wasn't meant to hear, and she looked out the window and tried to locate the version of this morning where she'd had coffee and gone home. She couldn't find it anymore. The townhouse was in a residential block, off 5th, narrow and deep, the kind of building that looked understated from the outside and revealed itself slowly as something else entirely once you were past the front door. An older woman named Mrs. Farrelly met them in the entryway. Housekeeper, Lillian gathered, though she had the demeanor of someone who had seen everything and categorized it already and moved on. She showed Lillian to a room on the 3rd floor without ceremony or excessive warmth and told her that the kitchen was available at any hour. Lillian set her bag on the bed and sat beside it. She'd been in this man's orbit for less than 24 hours, and she had already attended an engagement party, been publicly humiliated by her ex-husband, had a ring put on her finger by a stranger, learned that her ex-husband was a federal fraud suspect, been threatened by his attorney, and relocated to a townhouse off Fifth Avenue while an internal investigation ran somewhere overhead. She picked up her phone and called her mother. Not because her mother could fix any of this, because her mother's voice was the specific anchor she needed in the middle of whatever this was. "Lily," her mother said. "How eventful?" Lillian said. She didn't tell her everything. She told her enough she'd run into Graham. Things had gotten complicated. She was staying with a friend for a couple of days. Her mother asked 3 careful questions and then said, in the specific tone of a woman who had watched her daughter survive 7 years of gradual erasure, "Are you safe?" "Yes," Lillian said. "I think so," she said, which was more honest. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Is he kind to you?" Lillian looked at the ring on her finger. "I don't know him well enough yet," she said. "That's not what I asked," her mother said. Lillian thought about the terrace. The way he'd said he was wrong, without making it about himself. The ring that had been sitting in his possession for 2 weeks. The coffee this morning, the direct answers. The careful way he'd spoken about what Graham had done, not with anger, with something more precise than anger. "Yes," she said. "I think so." Her mother made a sound that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite relief, but was somewhere in the territory of both. Meanwhile, in a law office in Midtown that shared a building with 3 hedge funds and a private equity firm, Daniel Price was sitting across a glass conference table from Graham Calloway, and Graham Calloway was not taking the news well. Webb had called Price at 6 that morning. Webb had told Price what Carter had told him, that Lillian had been in the Blackwood building, that Roman had clearly brought her in, that whatever the intended scope of the original investigation, it was now expanding in a direction that included names and structures that had not been in the original evidence package. Graham sat in the conference room chair with his jacket still on. From the morning he hadn't been home yet. Or if he had, he'd come back out again quickly. And he had the look of a man who had not slept and was running on something that wasn't quite adrenaline anymore. Something meaner and more cornered. "They don't have anything on me that involves Marcus," Graham said. "They may have had," Price said carefully. "Whether they still have it as of this morning is a different question." "What does that mean?" "It means that Marcus spent last night making certain things less findable," Price said. "And that may have solved one problem and created another." Graham stared at him. "What other problem?" "The federal investigators received the original package before Marcus knew there was a problem," Price said. "What Marcus removed last night, if it was in the original package, has now been removed from a federal evidence set." The silence in the conference room was total. "He tampered with federal evidence," Graham said. "Technically, he tampered with records that were duplicated in the evidence set," Price said. "The originals may or may not." "Price." Graham's voice had dropped to something very quiet. "Are you telling me that Marcus Webb, in his attempt to protect himself, has made this worse?" Price was quiet for a moment. "I'm telling you," Price said carefully, "that the situation this morning is more complex than the situation yesterday." Graham stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his hands at his sides and his back to Price, and Price watched him and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and Price was smart enough to know it. What Graham was processing, standing at that window, was a sequence of events that had started 14 months ago when Marcus Webb had come to him with a proposal that had seemed, at the time, like the kind of opportunity that smart men recognized and careful men took. Structures were already in place. The access was there. The amounts were reasonable, not greedy, not obvious, the kind of numbers that got lost in complexity. Marcus had been the architect. Graham had been the instrument. That had seemed like a reasonable division of labor at the time. But Graham had the credentials, the access, the clean record. Marcus had the protection, the knowledge of the internal systems, the ability to ensure that questions didn't get asked by the people who might ask them. What Graham understood, standing at the window, was that he had confused Marcus's interest in protecting the scheme with Marcus's interest in protecting Graham. They were different interests, it turned out, and Marcus, when faced with the choice, had spent the night protecting himself. "Where is Marcus now?" Graham said. "Unavailable," Price said. Graham turned around. "What does that mean?" "It means he's not answering my calls," Price said. "Or his own attorneys." Graham looked at him for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "He's going to give them me." Price didn't answer, which was its own answer. Graham sat back down in the chair. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them, his hands, flat on the glass table, and he thought about the engagement party, and Lillian and the ring, and Roman Blackwood's voice saying, "Lillian Whitmore Blackwood is my wife," and the champagne glass shattering on the marble floor. And he thought about how 24 hours ago he'd been the one doing the humiliating, and how quickly and completely the geography of that had inverted. "My ex-wife," Graham said slowly. "What does she actually know?" "Nothing that we can determine," Price said. "But Roman brought her into the building this morning." "Why, we don't know. Find out," Graham said. Price hesitated. "Graham, given the call I made this morning contacting Ms. Whitmore directly it may have been a mistake." "I know it was a mistake," Graham said. I told you not to do it until I knew more." "You told me to send a message," Price said. "I told you to send a careful message," Graham said. The control in his voice was wearing thin at the edges. "Not to call her directly at 9 in the morning and threaten her. That's not careful. That's the kind of thing that makes Roman Blackwood decide she needs to be protected, which is exactly what we didn't want." Price sat with that. It was accurate. It was also too late. Back at the Blackwood organization's offices, the internal investigation had moved into a space that described no one as an emergency, but that everyone in the building understood was exactly that. The forensic accountants had been there since 7. A sound like green records, they were working through records with the focused, methodical energy of people who understood that speed mattered more than sleep. Roman sat in the conference room with 3 people: his lead attorney, the head of the forensic team, and a woman named Sonja Marsh, who had the title of senior analyst and the actual function of knowing where everything was and what it meant. San. They were going through the original evidence package against Graham, against the current state of the records, looking for what had changed overnight. The picture that emerged over 90 minutes was specific and ugly. Webb had not been as thorough as he'd hoped. He'd removed records from his own systems, cleaned out 3 sets of files that had connected him directly to the shell company structures. But the forensic team had preserved images of those files 6 weeks earlier, before Webb knew the investigation existed. The images were in an off-site backup that Webb hadn't thought to look for because he hadn't known it existed. The evidence against Graham was intact. The evidence against Webb was intact. What Webb had actually done, in his overnight scramble to protect himself, was destroy records that were already copied, and in doing so, had added a new charge to his own ledger. Romans listened to Sonja walk through it, with the attention of a man who needed every detail. Then he said, "Get the federal contact on the phone. They need to know about the tampering before they discover it themselves." "That accelerates the timeline," his attorney said. "I know," Roman said. "Do it." The attorney made the call. The timeline accelerated. At noon, Roman came upstairs to the townhouse. Lillian was at the kitchen table with her laptop, working through lesson plans she'd pulled from the school's shared drive. She had a substitute, but she was not the kind of person who left a substitute without a complete framework. She looked up when he came in. He looked like a man who'd been working hard for several hours and was not done. "How bad?" she said. She'd said it that morning, too. She was learning that it was the most useful question. He sat down across from her. Mrs. Farrelly appeared with coffee without being asked and disappeared again. "Webb tampered with federal evidence last night," Roman said. He thought he was protecting himself. He wasn't. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "The case against Graham is still intact. The case against Webb is now larger." Lillian's sat back and, Graham is going to spend today understanding that the man he trusted to protect him is now the man most likely to give him to federal investigators in exchange for his own terms." Roman paused. "Which means Graham is going to be looking for leverage." She felt it before she understood it. "Me," she said. "You don't have anything to give him," Roman said immediately. "There's nothing there." "But that's not how a desperate man thinks." "What does a desperate man think?" "That there's always something," Roman said. "That if he applies enough pressure to enough people, something will move." She looked at him. "He's going to come after me. He's going to try," Roman said. There was a distinction in that, and he meant it. "And I'm not going to let that happen. But I need you to understand what's happening, so you're not moving through it blind." She nodded slowly. She was holding herself very carefully. She realized the same way she'd held herself in the ballroom, the specific discipline of not letting the scale of something knock you off your feet. You said this started with Webb, she said. That Graham was the instrument. She stopped. Graham didn't come up with this. He got recruited. Yes. When he was working with your organization, Webb recruited him. That's my current understanding. She looked at the table. At her laptop, with its carefully constructed lesson plans, pronouns and paragraph structure, a unit she'd been building for a month. Coffee cup. At the ring on her hand. When Graham recruited me, she said, and then stopped. Because she'd said recruited and not married, which she'd have to think about later. Roman was watching her. When Graham and I met, she said carefully, he had just finished a partnership with a real estate firm. He was looking for the next position. He used to say that he found the right opportunities by finding the right people first. She paused. Do you think Webb found Graham the same way? Roman put down his coffee cup. Say that again, he said. Graham used to say that he identified people who had access to what he needed and built relationships with them before he needed the access. She looked up. Did Graham come to the organization through Webb, or did he come independently and Webb found him after? Roman was quiet for a moment. He came through a referral, Roman said slowly. Standard process. The referral came from a contact in the financial sector. He stopped. We checked the referral. It came back clean. Who checked it, Lillian said. Questions sat in the air between them. Roman looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not shock. He was too controlled for that, but something adjacent to it. The specific looks of a man who has just understood that the thing he thought he was holding was a different shape than he'd measured. He picked up his phone. Sonia, he said, when it connected. The original referral for Callaway. Who processed the background check? Pause. Lillian couldn't hear the response, but she watched Roman's face. When? He said. Another pause. Pull everything attached to that referral, Roman said. All of it. And don't talk to Carter about any of this. He ended the call. He sat across from her at the kitchen table in the townhouse off Fifth Avenue, and he was quiet. For a long moment could see something happening in him, a reordering, the kind that happened when the foundation of something you'd trusted shifted under you, and the whole structure required re-examining. The referral for Graham, he said. The background check. It was processed 6 months ago when questions first arose internally. He stopped. It was processed by Carter. She felt the room tilt slightly. Carter, who told Webb last night that I was here. Yes. So Carter has longer than one phone call, Roman said. Yes. She let that sit for a moment. Then she said, so the information you gave the federal investigators. The evidence package. Carter knew its contents. Carter sat in every meeting, Roman said. Yes. And Webb knew its contents because Carter told him. And Graham knew at least partially because Webb told him. Roman looked at her. You understand what you're describing, he said. I'm describing a chain, she said. From inside your organization out to Graham. Chain that's been in place long enough to have processed a background check for Graham 6 months ago, which means it was in place before the investigation formally began. She paused. Which means someone may have known the investigation was going to happen before it did. Roman was quiet. Roman. She leaned forward slightly. If someone inside knew the investigation was coming, if Carter tipped Webb and Webb tipped Graham, then Graham had time. Time for what? Roman said, though. Something in his voice told her he already knew. Time to move things, she said, before the investigation started. Not just what Webb moved last night, Graham himself. 6 months ago, when the internal questions first started. If he was warned, Roman stood up. He moved to the window. He stood there with his back to her, and she watched the line of his shoulders, and she thought about the night before, on the terrace, when he'd looked exactly like this, contained, and very still and very large, and she thought about the difference between who she'd thought he was at midnight and who she was beginning to understand he was in the morning light. He turned around. If Callaway moved assets 6 months ago, Roman said, then the evidence package that went to federal investigators may be missing the most significant portion of what he took. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was completely level, and somehow that made it worse. The numbers we were working with, he said. 14 months of documented theft. The amounts we compiled, he paused. If he moved things 6 months ago, the real number is larger, Lillian said. Significantly, Roman said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, Manhattan continued its indifferent, ordinary Tuesday life, taxis and foot traffic, and the ambient roar of a city that didn't stop for other people's crises. Inside the kitchen, Lillian sat with a ring on her finger and a lesson plan open on her laptop, and the specific, vertiginous sensation of a floor dropping away not under her feet, but under everything she'd understood about the situation she'd walked into. She had come to an engagement party to give her cousin a gift. She had ended up at the center of something that had been building for over a year, involving a conspiracy that reached from the man who'd humiliated her in a ballroom all the way into the heart of the organization, run by the man who'd put the ring on her finger, and the chain connecting them had been in place long enough that the real shape of the damage was still unknown. And Graham Calloway, the man who'd told a room full of people that nobody would ever choose her, had not been operating alone. He had been a piece in someone else's game, which meant the damage was larger than the investigation had measured, which meant the evidence package was incomplete, which meant that somewhere in the city, in accounts that no one had yet found, was money that belonged to the Blackwood organization, moved and hidden and covered over 6 months ago by a man who had been warned. She looked at Roman. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just understood that the investigation he'd thought was finished was, in fact, only at its beginning, and that the woman sitting at his kitchen table had just been the one to show him why. "I need to make some calls," he said. "I know," she said. He stopped at the doorway. He turned back. "How did you know to ask about the referral?" he said. She looked at him. "Because it's what Graham would do," she said simply. He never walked into a room he hadn't already arranged. Roman looked at her for one long, steady moment. Then he went to make his calls. Lillian turned back to her laptop. She stared at the lesson plan for a moment, the careful structure of it, the arc from introduction to practice to consolidation, and then she closed it. She picked up her phone. She had 3 texts from a number she didn't recognize. Not Price this time. A different number. The texts were brief. The first said, "You should ask your new friend what happened to the last person who helped him with an investigation." The second said, "Ask him about a woman named Clara Voss." The third said, "She thought she was safe too." Lillian read all 3. Then she set the phone face down on the table. She sat very still for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved. Upstairs, she could hear Roman's voice low, controlled, the specific register of a man working through something serious. She turned the ring on her finger once. Then she picked the phone back up and typed a single text to the unknown number. "Who are you?" 3 seconds. The response came back immediately. Someone who knows what Roman Blackwood does to people who become inconvenient. She stared at the screen. Then she heard Roman's footsteps on the stairs, coming back down, and she had exactly 4 seconds to decide what to do with what she'd just read, whether to show him immediately, whether to sit with it first, whether the texts were a threat or a warning, or simply the latest attempt by a desperate man to find leverage in the only place he hadn't yet tried. She put the phone in her pocket. She needed to know who Clara Voss was before she said anything to anyone, and in the 4 seconds before Roman came through the kitchen doorway, Lillian Whitmore understood that the careful, quiet life she had built for herself over 4 years had just ended completely, and whatever came next was going to require a version of her that was not careful and not quiet and had not yet been fully tested. Roman came through the kitchen doorway carrying 2 phones instead of 1, which told Lillian the calls had multiplied while he was upstairs. He looked at her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. The specific flat delivery of a man who read rooms for a living and had just read hers. She took the phone out of her pocket and put it on the table between them. He looked at the screen. He read all 3 texts in sequence, without touching the phone, without changing his expression, and then he looked up at her. "When did these come in?" he said. 4 minutes ago. "Did you respond?" She hesitated 1 second too long. "What did you send?" he said. "I asked who they were." He picked up the phone carefully, by the edges, as if it were evidence which she understood. A beat later was exactly what it was. He read her response. He read the reply. "Someone who knows what Roman Blackwood does to people who become inconvenient." He set the phone down. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the direct, unshielded attention. she was beginning to understand was how he handled things he took seriously. Ask me, he said. Clara Voss, she said. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The specific expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy and had just been asked to put it on the table. Clara Voss worked for the organization 4 years ago, he said. She was an analyst. She identified a financial irregularity in one of our import subsidiaries, a relatively small scheme. 3 people involved, running for about 8 months. He paused. She brought it to me directly. She was thorough. The evidence was solid. What happened to her? Lillian said. The 3 people involved were removed from the organization and the evidence was turned over through appropriate channels, Roman said. Clara received a significant financial recognition for her work and left the organization 6 months later to take a position at a private investment firm in Chicago. He held her gaze. She is, as of the last information I have, living in Evanston with her husband and running a successful compliance practice. Lillian looked at him. That's not the story whoever sent those texts wants me to believe, she said. No, Roman said, it isn't. So those texts came from someone who knows Clara's name and knows I wouldn't be able to verify that story quickly, she said. Someone who wants me scared and off balance. Yes. Graham, she said. Or someone working with Graham, Roman said. The number, can I send this to my tech team? Yes, she said. He photographed the screen with one of his phones and sent it somewhere without explanation. Then he looked back at her. I need to tell you something, he said. And I need to tell you now, before more of this morning happens. He paused, choosing the entry point carefully. Clara Voss's name is not publicly connected to that investigation. It was handled internally. The only people who would know her name in this context are people who were inside the organization at the time. Lillian felt the cold again. Carter. Or some Carter told, Romanson said. Or someone who was in a position to know 4 years ago and has been holding the name for exactly this kind of use. He stopped. What I'm telling you is that this is not Graham improvising. Someone gave him this. Someone who knows the organization's history well enough to find a name that would frighten you and not be easily verifiable. Webb, Lillian said. That's my working assumption. She sat with that. The architecture of it was becoming clearer, not simpler, but clearer. Webb inside, Carter as the channel, Graham as the front, and now the texts as the last available tool when everything else was closing down. Texts were a pressure play. Someone in a narrowing space throwing weight at the one variable they thought might still move. They think I'm the soft point, she said. Roman looked at her. Yes. Because I don't know enough to be dangerous, and I know enough to be useful to them if they can shake me loose from. She gestured at the space between them, the ring, the situation. From this. That's the theory they're operating on, Roman said. It's not a bad theory, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. What do you need from me today, she said. He looked at her for a moment, the specific look of a man recalibrating based on new data. Nothing you're not willing to give, he said. That's not an answer. The federal investigators want to speak with you, he said. Informally, voluntarily. Not as a subject, as someone who may have contextual information about Graham's working patterns from the period of your marriage. He paused. You can decline. It's entirely your choice. What would it do to the case if I declined? It wouldn't damage the case. The case is solid on its own. He paused. But you know Graham's methodology, the way he operated. Price's call this morning, and those texts suggest they're worried about what you might be able to tell them about he structures things about the way he identified and built access to opportunities. He paused again. If you described to investigators the same way you described it to me an hour ago, it would help them understand how Webb recruited him, she said. Yes. She put the coffee down. Set it up, she said. He nodded once. This afternoon, he said. Here, they'll come to you. Here, she repeated. Not their offices. My attorneys will be present, he said. You'll have full representation. You say only what you choose to say, you stop when you want to stop, and nothing you say is used in a way you haven't approved. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to walk into a federal building alone. I'm not asking you to walk anywhere alone right now. She looked at him. You're very careful with me, she said. Yes, he said simply. I need to know why, she said. Not the ring, not last night. The actual reason. Because you have a crisis in your organization, and a federal investigation expanding in real time, and a man on your board who has been working against you for how long? How long do you think Webb has been running this? Roman was quiet for a moment. 3 years, he said. Possibly longer. 3 years, she repeated. And you have Carter, who has been feeding him information for at least that long. And the evidence package needs to be rebuilt to account for 6 months of asset movement by Graham that nobody measured yet. You have a full catastrophe inside your own structure. She leaned forward slightly. And you're sitting here talking to me about attorneys and federal meetings and whether I feel safe. Why? The question sat between them. Roman looked at her for a long moment. Because in 20 years of running this organization, he said, a sound like Greenford, the only person who ever walked into a room full of people who were laughing at her and found the specific right words to say, not the performative words, not the defensive words, actual right words, and then walked out with her head. He stopped. I've been in a lot of difficult rooms. I've needed to find the right words in most of them. It's not a small thing. She held that. That's still not a complete answer, she said. No, he said, but it's the honest part again. Something happened in the room, a shift, slight and significant. The kind that happens when two people have been talking around a thing, and both of them know it, and one of them has just acknowledged it. Then his phone rang. Both of them. He looked at the screen. I need to take this. Go, she said. He went. She sat in the kitchen for 3 minutes. Then she went upstairs, changed into the spare clothes, Mrs. Farrelly had quietly left outside her door, practical or approximate size, no explanation attached, and came back down. The federal investigators arrived at 2:15. There were 2 of them, a woman named Diane Forsyth, who did most of the talking, and a man named Reeves, who took notes and occasionally asked a question that turned out to be more important than it sounded. Forsyth in her mid-40s, with the Seth was somewhere in her mid-someone who had sat across from a lot of people in a lot of rooms and was very good at making the room feel informal while being entirely in control of it. Roman's lead attorney sat beside Lillian. His name was Garrison, and he was the kind of lawyer who conveyed competence primarily through stillness. He moved almost nothing, said almost nothing. A sound like green wood splitting, and Lillian quickly understood that what he was doing was listening to word Forsyth asked and measuring the gap between what was being asked and what was actually wanted. Lillian answered for 2 hours. A sound like green wood splitting. She described Graham's professional methodology in the same terms she'd used with Roman, the way he mapped access points before he needed them, the way he built relationships specifically around what they could provide, the way he'd always spoken about opportunity as something you arranged, rather than something you encountered. She described specific conversations from their marriage, 3 or 4 that she could date with reasonable accuracy because they'd been attached to other events she remembered clearly. She described the way Graham handled money, not his money, other people's money, the way he talked about it, the respect he had for its movement, and the contempt he had for anyone who didn't understand how to move it. Forsyth listened to all of this with complete attention and almost no reaction, which was its own form of reaction. Reeves asked, at one point, whether Graham had ever mentioned a name. He offered 4 names, one at a time. Lillian didn't recognize the first 2. The third name was Marcus Webb, which she recognized from this morning, and she said so clearly and watched Forsyth's expression do something very small and very controlled. The 4th name was Carter, first name only, which she also recognized. Garrison put his hand flat on the table when the 4th name came up. We'll take a short break, he said. The break was 6 minutes. Garrison spent 4 of them in the hallway with Lillian and said 3 things. The first was that she was doing well. The second was that the 4th name was more significant than its casual introduction, and she should be aware of that. The third was that she was not required to answer anything further and could end the meeting at any point. I know, she said. I want to keep going. All right, he said. They went back in. Lillian continued. She did not know Carter's full name from the marriage. She knew the name from this morning from Roman's office, and she said that clearly she'd heard the name in a specific context, and she could describe that context if it was useful. Forsyth said it was useful. Garrison nodded. Lillian described the morning accurately, and completely Carter's arrival in Roman's office. The admission, Roman's response, the subsequent information about the original referral for Graham, and who had processed the background check. When she finished, Forsyth was quiet for a moment. "It's Whitmore," she said. "In your estimation, and I understand this is informal, does Roman Blackwood know the full extent of what's happened inside his organization?" Garrison started to move. "You can answer that," he said to Lillian quietly. "Or not." Lillian looked at Forsyth. "He's known since this morning that it's larger than he thought," she said. "Whether he knows the full extent, I don't think anyone knows the full extent yet." She paused. "But he's not trying to contain it. He called your office about the tampering before you discovered it yourself. That's not what a man trying to control a narrative does." Forsyth held her gaze for a moment. Then she closed her folder. "Thank you," she said. "We may need to speak again." "I know," Lillian said. The investigators left at 4:30. Rome was in the study when Lillian found him a room she hadn't been in before, smaller than the office at the organization's building, lined with books that looked read rather than decorative. He was on the phone. He held up one finger when she appeared in the doorway, and she waited, and the call ended 90 seconds later. "How did it go?" he said. "They asked about Carter," she said. "By first name only. The way they asked it. They already knew," Roman said. "Yes. They've been looking at Carter independently. Not as part of the Graham investigation, as part of something else." He paused. "Carter has been useful to more than one interested party over the last few years." She leaned against the doorframe. "How long have you known?" "I suspected Carter for 3 months," Roman said. "I didn't have confirmation until this morning." He looked at her directly. "I moved too slowly. I thought I had more time before it mattered." It was the first time she'd heard him admit something like that. She noted it, the shape of it, the absence of defensive packaging around it, the straightforward quality of a man who was capable of saying, "I was wrong," without making it a performance of humility. "What happens to him?" she said. "Carter will cooperate," Roman said. "He doesn't have a choice now. He gave himself away this morning by reacting the wrong way to information he shouldn't have been surprised by." He paused. "He'll trade what he knows about Webb for whatever terms he can negotiate. And Webb." Roman was quiet for a moment. "Webb made a significant error last night," he said. "He thought he was protecting himself. He was actually demonstrating that he knew exactly what needed to be hidden and exactly where to find it, which is not the behavior of an innocent man, and is also not the behavior of a man who can credibly claim he didn't understand what Graham was doing." He paused. "Webb's position has gone from complicated to untenable in the last 8 hours. Because of what I asked you this morning," Lillian said. "About the referral." "Yes," Roman said. "If you hadn't asked that question, it would have taken us another week to get there." He held her gaze. "We would have gotten there. But a week is a long time when people are destroying records." She looked at him across the study. "I want to go home tonight," she said. He looked at her steadily. "The texts, I know about the texts," she said. "They were a pressure play. If Webb is as cornered as you're describing, he doesn't have the bandwidth to do anything more than send texts. Graham is in a law office, somewhere figuring out that his partner is about to give him away. Neither of them is thinking about me right now." "Probably not," Roman said. "But probably isn't the same as Roman." She said his name in the specific way that stopped a sentence. He recognized it. He went quiet. "I have been rearranging my life around what Graham Calloway might do since the divorce. I stopped going to certain restaurants because he went there. I left a book club because 2 of the members were his friends. I built my entire life in Brooklyn around the fact that Graham lived in Manhattan, and I wanted the distance." She paused. "I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going home tonight." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I'll have someone outside," he said. "That's your choice," she said. "Not mine." "Yes," he said. "It is." She almost smiled. She went home at 6. The car dropped her at her building in Brooklyn, and she was aware, without looking, of a second car that stopped half a block behind and stayed there. She didn't comment on it. She went upstairs. She made tea she actually drank this time, standing at her kitchen window, looking at the ordinary street below, and she thought about the last 36 hours with the specific, methodical attention of someone who needed to understand what had happened to her before she could decide what to do next. She took the ring off. She put it on the windowsill. She looked at sitting there in the streetlight, coming through the glass. Then she put it back on. She told herself that was about not wanting to lose it. She almost believed herself this time. At 9 the next morning, Carter walked into the federal building on Worth Street with his attorney and spent 4 hours in a room with Forsyth and Reeves and 2 other investigators whose names Lillian would never learn. Carter was methodical and specific, and, Garrison later told her, clearly had been thinking about this moment for some time and had organized his cooperation the way a man organized the thing he'd been preparing for, whether he wanted to or not. He gave them Webb. He gave them the timeline, 3 years of it, starting before Graham, starting with a previous instrument who'd left the organization before the scheme, was mature enough to be profitable. A man who'd been replaced by Graham, precisely because Graham was more talented and more careful. He gave them the referral chain, not just the background check on Graham, but the system Webb had built for ensuring that the right people landed in the right positions. 3 people over 3 years, Carter the consistent point of contact, Webb the consistent architect. And he gave them numbers, the actual numbers, not the 14 months of documented theft that had been in the original evidence package. The real numbers, including what Graham had moved in the 6 months before the investigation formally began, including what Webb had extracted through parallel structures that had never been connected to Graham at all. The real number was more than 4 times what the original investigation had measured. Roman received this information at 2 in the afternoon. He called Lillian. "Are you sitting down?" he said. "I'm standing in front of a whiteboard," she said. "I'm teaching. I'll call you at 4. "Tell me now," she said. Pause. He told her the number. She sat down on the edge of her desk. Her students watched her with the particular attention of teenagers who understood something significant had just happened, but not what. "Are you all right?" Roman said. "Yes," she said. Yes, he said. "It is. Your organization will survive it," he said. "It's significant. It's not terminal. And recovering what can be recovered is now a law enforcement matter, which means the resources available for it are different than what we had working internally. Process that." "Graham," she said. "Graham is at his attorney's office," Roman said. "He has been there since 8 this morning. My understanding is that they've been in discussions about the terms of his cooperation since Carter walked into federal building. He's going to cooperate. He doesn't have a choice," Roman said. "Webb moved first. Graham is behind him in the line. Whatever Graham offers, Webb has already offered more. So Graham will cooperate fully, and it won't be enough to avoid consequences," Roman said. "He'll trade what he can. It won't be as much as he thinks." She looked at the whiteboard. The lesson she'd been in the middle of a grammar unit. The mechanics of dependent clauses looked completely surreal against the backdrop of the conversation she was having. "Call you at 4, she said. 4, he agreed. "Put the phone down." She looked at her students. A sound like green 2-year-olds looking back at her with the specific alert of young people who understood they were watching something real. "Dependent clauses," she said. She picked up the marker. "A clause that cannot stand alone." A girl in the second row, Mia, one of the sharper ones, said, "Are you okay, Ms. Whitmore?" "Yes," Lillian said. "I'm fine." She paused. "I'm having a complicated week." Mia nodded seriously, as if this was a satisfying answer. The 4 o'clock call was shorter than she expected. Because by the time it happened, the situation had moved again in the particular relentless way of situations that have found their own momentum. Webb had surfaced. Not in the federal building, not through his attorney, not through any of the channels that a man in his position was expected to use. He had surfaced in Roman's offices, physically, arriving at the building at 3:40 with 2 attorneys and a security detail that the lobby staff had looked at and then looked at each other about before calling upstairs. Roman had taken the meeting. Lillian heard this at 4 and said, "He just walked in." "Yes," Roman said. "Why?" "Because he understands that the investigation running through federal channels is a problem he can't control," Roman said, "and that the alternative, dealing directly with me, is something he thinks he can manage." She was quiet for a moment. "He thinks he can negotiate with you," she said, outside the formal process. "Yes, can he know?" Roman said. "But I let him think so long enough to hear what he has to say." "What does he have to say?" "He has a version of events in which he is a passive participant who was manipulated by Graham," Roman said. "Quite detailed. Some of it is even partially true, in the way that a story is partially true, when the true parts are selected to support the conclusion the storyteller wants. And he has an offer," Roman said. "He'll return what he took directly." not through formal channels directly, to the organization. And he wants the organization to withdraw from the federal investigation. The air in Lillian's classroom empty now, students gone, afternoon light going gray through the windows felt very still. Can you do that? She said. Legally. The organization can decline to pursue its own civil remedies, Roman said. What we can't do is interfere with a federal criminal investigation, which Webb knows. So what he's actually offering is money in exchange for the appearance of cooperation, while the federal investigation proceeds on its own. He thinks that if you take the money, you'll be less motivated to actively assist the investigation, she said. Yes, Roman said. Are you going to take it? A pause. No, he said. She exhaled. Good, she said. She heard something in the background of the call movement, a door voices she couldn't make out. Roman said something away from the phone. Then he came back. I need to go back in, he said. Go, she said. Lillian, he stopped. Stay at the school for another hour. Don't go home until I call you. She started to say something about not rearranging her life. Please, he said. The word landed differently than she expected. Not as a command dressed as courtesy, as an actual request from a man who didn't make them easily. 1 hour, she said. She sat in her empty classroom for 45 minutes grading papers she barely read. Then she walked to the faculty room and made bad coffee and stood at the window, looking at the school parking lot, while the situation she was embedded in moved through its next hour without her. At 4:50, Roman called back. Webb is gone, he said. Did he? He left when I told him I wouldn't take the money and that the meeting was being recorded, Roman said. He took both attorneys and the security detail. And he was significantly less composed leaving than he was arriving. Is he going to run? Lillian said. His passport has been flagged since this morning, Roman said. He's not going anywhere. A pause. The recording goes to Forsyth tonight. She set down the bad coffee. It's almost over, she said. Formal part, he said. The formal part is almost over. She understood what he meant. There was a different part. The part that wasn't about evidence and cooperation agreements and formal proceedings. And that part was still somewhere ahead of them, undefined, moving toward a shape she couldn't quite see yet. I'm coming to get you, he said, from the school. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She thought about saying she'd take a cab. All right, she said. He was there in 18. She was waiting outside the school on the front steps in the gray late afternoon, her bag over her shoulder, and the ring catching the last of the light, and the dark car pulled up, and Roman got out of the passenger side, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected the car to stop, and the door to open, and a driver to wait. Instead, he got out and walked to where she was standing on the steps. He looked like a man who had been in a difficult room for several hours and had managed it, but not easily. Careful steadiness was there, but the day was on him in the set of his jaw, in the slight tightness around his eye, in the way he stood in front of her with something he needed to say, and was taking a moment to find the right form for it. Graham's attorney called Garrison an hour ago, he said. She waited. Graham is cooperating with the federal investigation, he said. He's giving them Webb. The structures, the timeline, everything, in exchange for terms. He paused. As part of his cooperation, he was required to withdraw the implied threats to you and confirm that you had no knowledge of or involvement in any of the financial activity. Lillian stood on the school steps in the gray afternoon air and held that. He confirmed it in writing, Roman said. Your name is out of it. Completely. She nodded. Are you all right? He said. Yes, she said. Lillian. She stopped. She looked at the ring. Then she looked at him. I spent the last 2 days being used as a pressure point by a man who spent 7 years telling me I wasn't enough. And the reason he had to withdraw the pressure is because he ran out of room. She paused. I don't feel victorious. I feel tired. I know, Roman said. That's the honest part, she said, echoing him. He almost smiled. The edge of it. Come on, he said. Let's get you away from this building. They got in the car. The city moved around them in the particular amber light of a late afternoon in autumn, and Lillian sat with her bag in her lap and the ring on her finger and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been operating at a frequency that body and mind can't sustain indefinitely. What happens tomorrow? She said. Tomorrow the investigators have what they need, Roman said. The process runs its course from there. Webb will be taken into custody within 48 hours. He's not cooperating through channels. which means he's made himself a flight risk in the eyes of the investigation regardless of the passport flag. He paused. Graham's cooperation is formal as of tonight. His assets are frozen. His career— He stopped. There isn't one on the other side of this. She was quiet. Carter, she said. Carter will testify, Roman said. His terms will depend on how complete his information turns out to be. He gave them a great deal this morning. Whether it's us enough, he paused. Not my decision. She looked out the window. The organization, she said, will restructure, he said, significantly. I've known for some time that certain parts of how we operate needed to change. He paused. This accelerated that. She turned to look at him. Is that— She stopped, because she wasn't sure how to ask what she wanted to ask, splitting, which was whether the organization on the other side of this restructuring was going to be something different, something with less gray area, something closer to the side of things that she could inhabit without the particular discomfort of knowing exactly how it worked. He looked at her. Ask the question, he said. What does the organization look like? She said. After this is over. He held her gaze for a moment. Different, he said. Smaller in some ways. More controlled. Less dependent on relationships that require latitude. He paused. I've been moving in that direction for 2 years. Webb's scheme accelerated the timeline by probably 18 months. Is that what you want, she said? Or is it what the situation requires? He was quiet for a moment. Both, he said, which is usually when significant changes actually happen. The car moved through traffic. Outside the window, a bodega, a dry cleaner, a school entrance, with parents collecting children, the ordinary machinery of the city turning through its afternoon without any interest in what was happening inside this car. I need to tell you something, Roman said. She looked at him. When I walked into that ballroom on Tuesday night, I had a plan. Plan was specific, and it was about Graham, and it had nothing to do with you. He stopped. You were a variable I hadn't fully considered. I was there when you arrived, she said. Yes, he said. And when I saw what was happening, when I saw him doing that, in front of everyone, and I saw you standing there, he stopped again. The pauses were different from his usual pauses. Those were deliberate, measured. The pauses of a man who chose his words carefully. These were the pauses of a man who was doing something he didn't do easily. I made an impulsive choice. You had the ring for 2 weeks, she said. I brought the ring because I had considered the possibility of introducing myself to you at some point, he said. I hadn't decided on that moment or that method. He held her gaze. I need you to know that I'm aware of how that Roman. She said his name in the specific way again. He stopped. I know, he looked at her. I know it was impulsive, she said. I know you walked into a situation you hadn't fully planned. I know the ring and the announcement were— She considered the word— dramatic. She paused. I also know that you called the federal investigators about the tampering before you needed to. I know you set up the meeting with Forsyth in a way that protected me throughout. I know you answered every question I asked. Directly, even when the answers were uncomfortable. She stopped. I'm a person who pays attention. I've been paying attention for 2 days. The car was stopped at a light. What have you noticed? He said quietly. She looked at him in the amber light. That you're not who Graham told 40 people you were, she said. The version where you're the dangerous man who arrived to embarrass him, that's him. That's the story Graham needed. The actual version is a man who has been running something complicated for a long time and is trying to run it with more integrity than the situation sometimes permits. She paused. And who brought a ring to an engagement party because he didn't like watching someone get hurt. He looked at her. The light changed. The car moved. The ring, he said finally. The ring, she agreed. It belongs on your hand, he said. I didn't plan that as a line. It's just what I think. She looked at the ring. I kept it on, she said. Last night, I took it off and put it back on. I know, he said. Mrs. Fairley called me. She stared at him. Mrs. Fairley called you. She was watching to make sure you were safe, he said. She noticed. Mrs. Fairley is your— She's worked for me for 11 years, he said. She notices everything. I should have mentioned that. Lillian stared at him for a moment. Then she laughed the same real, unplanned sound as the night before on the Tesserus, the kind that surprised both of them. Your housekeeper is monitoring my ring-wearing habits, she said. She's protective, Roman said. There was something in his voice that was almost warmth. Almost. The car turned onto her block in Brooklyn. stopped outside her building. She didn't move immediately. She sat with her bag in her lap and the ring on her finger, and the 2 days of this behind her, the ballroom, the terrace, the coffee, the morning calls, the federal investigators, Webb walking in and walking out, the classroom, the steps, this car in the amber light, and she thought about what came next. Coffee tomorrow, she said. My apartment. 7 a.m. He looked at her. I'll make it, she said. And you're going to answer the rest of my questions. All of them. All of them, he said. Including the ones about the organization, she said. What it was and what it's going to be and where the line is. She held his gaze. Because I need to know where the line is, Roman. I need to know that before anything else happens. He looked at her with the full, unshielded attention she had come to expect, and still wasn't quite used to. 7 a.m., he said. I'll be there. She got out of the car. She was halfway up the steps to her building when she heard the car door open behind her. She turned. Roman was standing on the sidewalk. He hadn't followed her up the steps. He was standing at the bottom of them, in the amber streetlight, looking up at her with something on his face she'd need more time to fully read. Lillian, he said. She waited. I'm going to get this right, he said. What I'm trying to do here. I'm going to get it right. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. She went inside. She stood in her apartment entryway with her back against the closed door, and her eyes shut and her heart doing something it hadn't done in a very long time. Not racing, not panicked, not the adrenaline-adjacent fear response she'd been running on for 2 days. Something slower and warmer and considerably more terrifying. She opened her eyes. She looked at the ring. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. Not the same unknown number as before, different prefix, different pattern. She answered. The voice on the other end was not Graham, not Price, not Webb, not any of the voices she'd been tracking for 2 days. It was a woman. Ms. Whitmore, the voice said. My name is Clara Voss. I think we need to talk. The room went very still. How did you get this number? Lillian said. Roman gave it to me, Clara Voss said. Tonight, he said you'd been told something about me, and that you deserved to hear the actual version from me directly. Lillian stood in her entryway with the ring on her finger, and the door solid at her back. Tell me, she said. And Clara Voss began to talk, and what she said over the next 20 minutes was not a horror story and not a warning, and not the thing the text had implied, but something more complicated and more useful. The actual account of a woman who had worked inside something difficult and found a way through it and come out the other side into a life that was genuinely hers, and who was calling because a man she trusted had asked her to make sure that another woman had the truth before she made her decision. When Clara finished, Lillian stood in the quiet of her apartment for a long moment. Then she typed a text to Roman. Thank you for Clara. The response came back in 40 seconds. She offered. I just passed along the number. Lillian looked at the message. Then she looked at the ring. Then she went to her kitchen and made tea she actually wanted, and sat at the table in the light of her own apartment, the small, clean, carefully chosen life she'd built, and thought about what it meant that, for the first time in 4 years, the life she'd built felt like a beginning instead of a shelter. Outside, half a block down, a dark car sat at the curb. She knew it was there. She left the kitchen light on so whoever was in it could see she was fine. And tomorrow morning, at 7 a.m., Roman Blackwood was going to sit at this table and drink her coffee and answer every question she had left. And the line between what had been and what was coming was right here, right now, in the light of this kitchen on this ordinary Brooklyn street. And everything on the other side of it was still being decided. Roman arrived at 6:58. Lillian heard the knock and looked at the clock on the stove and noted the 2 minutes with something she didn't quite have a name for yet, the specific quality of a person who shows up slightly early because they mean it, rather than because they're performing punctuality. Opened the door and he was standing in the hallway in a dark jacket with no tie, a paper bag in one hand, looking like a man who had also not slept particularly well and wasn't trying to hide it. I brought something, he said. She looked at the bag. I said I'd make coffee. You did, he said. These are from a bakery on Court Street. I was early. She stepped back and let him in. He looked at her apartment the way she'd known. He was not assessing it, not comparing it to the townhouse off Fifth, but actually seeing it. The books on the shelves arranged by subject rather than aesthetics. The kitchen table with its one good lamp, The whiteboard she'd installed on the wall beside the window for lesson planning, currently caught covered in a grammar diagram she hadn't erased. The small, deliberate life of a woman who had chosen every object in the room for a reason. He put the bag on the table. She poured the coffee. They sat down across from each other at 7 a.m. in the ordinary light of her Brooklyn kitchen, and Lillian put both hands around her mug and looked at him and said, "Start from the beginning." The actual beginning. He started from the beginning. It took 40 minutes. He didn't rush it, and she didn't let him. When he used a term she didn't know, she asked what it meant. And he explained, without condescension. A sound like green wood splitting. When he described it required her to recalibrate her understanding of the previous 2 days, she stopped him and worked through the recalibration out loud, and he waited without interrupting, which was the kind of patience she had rarely experienced in a man and never taken for granted. The organization, he told her, had started as something genuinely gray, the kind of enterprise that lives in the space between what the law permits and what it can see. His father had built it that way, deliberately. In the late 80s, the landscape of certain industries in the Northeast required relationship with people who didn't file paperwork and agreements that weren't written down. By the time Roman inherited operational control at 32, the gray had become structural, built into the architecture of how the organization functioned, not incidental to it. "I've spent 6 years trying to move it toward something more defensible," he said. "Not because I'm afraid of exposure. Because I'm tired of running something that requires me to protect the wrong people." "Webb," she said. "Webb is the version of that problem that got large enough to become undeniable," he said. "He's not the first, he's the most expensive." He paused. "The restructuring I described, it's real. The federal investigation accelerated it, but the direction was already decided. I want to be able to point at every part of what I do and say that it stands." She looked at him. "Can you get there mostly?" he said. Honest, not promising more than he could deliver. "There are relationships I've maintained for years that will need to end. Some of those endings will be complicated. Some of the people involved will not take it gracefully." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you this because you asked for the line, and I want you to understand that the line exists, but the path to it isn't clean." She nodded slowly. "The foundation," she said. "The legitimate one. The literacy programs. Fully separate," he said. "Always has been. I made sure of that from the start because I needed something in my professional life that I didn't have to defend in a complicated way." He paused. "It's the thing I'm most straightforwardly proud of." She looked at the whiteboard on her wall. The grammar diagram. Logic of it. The careful language worked when you understood its structure, the way it opened things up for people who'd been closed out of it. "I want to see what you're doing," she said, "with the programs. I want to look at the curriculum frameworks and the assessment structures and the teacher training components, and I want to tell you what's working and what isn't." "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "It's not a yes to anything else," she said. "It's a yes to that one thing. The rest needs time." "I know," he said. "Roman." She held his gaze. "I need you to understand something about who I was before Tuesday night and who I'm still being, regardless of what happened in that ballroom." She paused, choosing the form for it. "I'm not a woman who moves fast because the momentum is there. I moved fast once I met Graham 6 months before we got engaged, and I told myself that certainty was the same as readiness. It wasn't." She stopped. "I'm not comparing you to him. I'm telling you about myself." He looked at her steadily. "I understand. Do you?" "Yes," he said. "I have a ring that's been sitting in a box for 2 weeks because I kept finding reasons why the moment wasn't right." "That's not fast." He paused. "I'm also not a man who mistakes patience for inaction. I know what I want. I'm willing to let it develop at a pace that actually sticks." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and picked up one of the pastries from the bag he'd brought. She took a bite. It was good, the real kind. The kind from a place that had been doing one thing for 30 years. "Court Street Bakery," she said. "Yes. I've been going there for 4 years," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I know. Mrs. Farrelly told me." She shook her head slowly. Then she picked up her coffee and the morning settled into something quieter, the way mornings do when the crisis has passed its peak, and what remains is the work of understanding what it left behind. 2 weeks later, Marcus Webb was taken into federal custody at a private airport in New Jersey, 40 minutes before the chartered flight he'd booked was scheduled to depart for Lisbon. His passport flag had done its job. His attorney spent the next 72 hours negotiating terms that satisfied no one, which was approximately what terms look like when a man has used up all his leverage, and the people he'd expected to protect him have already chosen themselves instead. Carter testified over 3 days. What he gave the investigators was thorough enough that Garrison later described it to Roman as the most useful cooperation he'd seen in 15 years of working adjacent to federal proceedings, which was not a compliment to Carter's character, but was an accurate description of the value of his information. Carter had, it turned out, understood the architecture of what Webb had built far more completely than anyone had estimated, because Carter had been its primary maintenance mechanism for 3 years, and maintenance requires comprehension. His terms were not generous, but they were terms, which was better than the alternative. Graham Calloway's cooperation was complete and cost him everything it was supposed to cost him. He gave the investigators the full account of his recruitment, the dinner with Webb 14 months in. The careful way Webb had explained the structure, the specific reassurances Webb had offered about the safety of the scheme and the protection available to Graham should anything go wrong. He gave them the accounts, the shell structures, the vendor names, the transaction sequences. He gave them the 6 months of asset movement he'd executed before the investigation began. Accounted green one, which accounted for the gap in the original evidence package and brought the total number to a figure that when federal investigators' expressions go very flat and very focused. He gave them all of it. It was not enough to avoid consequences. It was enough to define the shape of those consequences, which in the calculus of cooperation was the most Graham had to offer. His assets were frozen, and then, where they could be traced to the scheme, forfeited. The career, the credentials, the industry connections, the reputation that had let him stand in a Manhattan ballroom and describe himself as the arbiter of who was worth choosing was finished. Not damaged. Finished. The kind of finished that doesn't recover, that doesn't have a second act in the same industry or the same city, that requires starting over somewhere else with a different story and a longer explanation. Lillian learned the details gradually, through Garrison, through occasional calls from Forsyth's office, confirming that her name remained clear of the proceedings, through the quiet accumulation of information that arrived over 3 weeks. She didn't seek it out aggressively. She didn't avoid it either. She read what she received, she understood it, and she set it down. She found to her own slight surprise that she felt almost nothing about Graham's outcome. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not the complicated guilty pleasure of watching someone who hurt you get what they had coming. She'd spent 4 years expecting that if this moment ever arrived, if Graham ever faced a real consequence for the gap between the man he presented and the man he was, she would feel something definitive. Closure, maybe, if that was a real thing. Release. What she actually felt was the absence of something she hadn't known she was still carrying. Like a sound she'd been hearing, for so long she'd stopped registering it, and then it stopped, and the silence was noticeable, but not dramatic. She mentioned this to her therapist. She'd gone back, briefly, not because the crisis had broken her, but because she'd learned that difficult periods were easier to process with a guide who wasn't involved in them. Her therapist, a woman named Dr. Osi, who had the useful quality of listening longer than most people before she responded, said something Lillian thought about for days afterward. "You spent 4 years grieving a marriage that was already over. When it was happening, Doctor," Osai said, "the grief is done. There's nothing left to feel." Lillian sat with that. "Is that healthy?" she said. "It means you did the work," Dr. Osi said. "The work you did after the divorce, the rebuilding, the therapy, the teaching, the small careful choices, that was the process. Graham going to prison isn't the end of something. You already ended it." She thought about this on the subway home. She thought about it at the kitchen table that night. She thought about it the next morning, when she put on the ring, which she had now stopped taking off, which was a decision she'd made, without making it, the best kind. The ring was real. She'd confirmed that with a jeweler in the 3rd week. She'd walked in on a Thursday afternoon, without telling anyone she was going, and the small older man who looked at jeweler, the specific attention of someone who had been looking at them his whole life, Hantast Hurling, had examined it for 90 seconds and told her it was platinum, well made, sized by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and worth considerably more than its understated appearance suggested. She'd thanked him and walked out and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Someone had known her ring size. She'd thought about that on the first night, had filed it under questions for later. She asked Roman about it the following Saturday, when they were walking through the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, because she'd suggested it, and he'd arrived at her door at 9 a.m. ready to walk anywhere she wanted to go. "How did you know my ring size?" she said. He was quiet for 3 steps. "Caroline," he said. "Caroline told you my ring size." "She didn't know why I was asking," he said. "I told her I was looking at jewelry for a gift, and I needed a reference point for sizing." Lillian looked at the path ahead of them. A couple with a stroller. An elderly man on a bench, feeding something small and determined looking out of his coat pocket. The ordinary Saturday life of people who weren't involved in federal fraud investigations. "You planned this," she said. "More than you admitted." "I planned some of it," he said. "The ring. The possibility of introducing myself to you." He paused. "I didn't plan the engagement party. I didn't plan walking in at that specific moment. I'd been looking for an appropriate context for months, and then Caroline called, and it was that context," Lillian said. "And it was that," he said. She turned to look at him as they walked. He was looking ahead, profile toward her, the morning light doing something honest, to his face showing the lines of it, the places where the years had settled in without apology. "Roman," she said. He looked at her. "I need you to know that I'm not here because you rescued me," she said. "That night in the ballroom, what you did made a difference. But I had already said what I needed to say to Graham before you walked in. I had already decided not to break." She held his gaze. "I was walking toward the door." "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because you were walking toward the door alone," he said. "And you didn't have to." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she kept walking. He walked beside her. They didn't hold hands. That came later by degrees in the gradual way of 2 people who have each been careful for long enough that they recognize careful in each other and give it the room it needs. But they walked side by side through the October morning with the ring on her finger and the case closing behind them and the foundation work beginning ahead of them. And somewhere in the space between those 2 things was something that was, quietly and without announcement, a beginning. The gala was Roman's idea, but Lillian shaped it. He brought her the concept in November, the annual charity event the Blackwood Foundation held each year, which had in previous years been a standard industry gathering, well-attended and well-funded and largely unremarkable in its structure. This year, he said, he wanted to change the focus. Women rebuilding their lives after abusive marriages, financial hardship, the specific kinds of difficulty that didn't always look dramatic from the outside, but were quietly devastating. He wanted it to actually be about something. He asked if she wanted to be involved in the programming. She spent 3 weeks on it. She called Clara Voss, who was unexpectedly enthusiastic and contributed 2 hours of consultation at no charge. She called Dr. Osei, who referred her to 2 colleagues who worked specifically with women in financial recovery situations. She built a program structure that had content, actual content, not the decorative inspiration that charity events usually offered, and she fought with Roman's events team twice. About the difference between useful and polished. "It doesn't have to be polished," she told the events coordinator, a very organized woman named Rachel, who clearly found Lillian's priorities disorienting. "It has to be true." Rachel looked at her. "People come to these events," Lillian said, "and they hear stories that are designed to make them feel good. I want them to hear stories that make them feel seen. There's a difference." Rachel made a note. "She's right," Roman said from the doorway, where he had apparently been standing long enough to hear the relevant portion of the conversation. Rachel looked at him. "Incorporate her notes," he said. Then he looked at Lillian. "And you're running the program segment." "I'm not a public speaker," she said. "You speak in front of 30 teenagers every day," he said. "That's different." "How?" She opened her mouth. Closed it. "Fine," she said. The gala was held in December, in the ballroom of a different Manhattan hotel from the Meridian. Lillian had specified that without being asked, and Roman had not asked why, which was the kind of understanding that had started to characterize how they operated together. The room was full by 7:30. Not the same crowd as Caroline's engagement party, different people, a different composition, though there were overlaps. Some of the same faces. Some people who recognized Lillian and whose expressions carried the memory of what they'd seen in October. She noticed this and noted it and set it aside. She was wearing a different dress. Midnight blue, not emerald green. She'd bought it specifically for this, which meant she'd chosen it for an occasion she was choosing to attend, rather than one she'd talked herself into. And that distinction felt important in a way she didn't try to make anyone else understand. Caroline was there. Caroline and Derek, 3 weeks from their own wedding, sitting at a table near the front, because Lillian had put them there. Caroline had spent November alternating between apologizing for the engagement party and being transparently thrilled about how it had turned out, which Lillian found both exhausting and, at its core, deeply loving. She had told Caroline 3 times that she didn't need to apologize. She had given up telling her and started accepting the apologies as the expression of affection they actually were. Roman was across the room when Lillian arrived, talking to 3 people she didn't recognize. But he saw her come in and the conversation didn't stop. But his attention shifted, the specific, total attention she had become familiar with, the kind that somehow managed to be complete without being possessive. He crossed the room when the other conversation reached a natural pause. "You look..." He stopped. He looked at her the way he looked at her, which was directly and without the performative hesitation men sometimes used as a kind of flattery. Good was not the word he used. He used a different word, quiet and specific, and she felt it the way she'd learned to feel things he said, not with the flinching evaluation of a woman, checking whether she measured up, but with the straightforward reception of a woman who was allowed to be told something true. "Thank you," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. The evening ran the way she'd structured it, the dinner, the brief remarks from the Foundation's executive director, 2 speakers who had come through the organization's recovery programs and spoke without a script in a way that made the room go very quiet in the particular way of people listening to something real. A 3rd speaker who broke down twice and kept going both times, which produced in the audience the specific honest emotion that polished presentations can't manufacture. Then it was Lillian's turn. She walked to the front of the room alone. She looked out at the tables, the dressed-up crowd, the people who had come because it was the right event to be seen at, and the people who had come because they actually cared, and the people who had no idea yet which category they were in and would decide tonight. She saw Caroline's face in the front table, leaning forward slightly. She saw Roman standing at the back of the room, arms loose at his sides, watching her. She didn't have notes. She'd written them and then put them down. "I came to an engagement party in October," she said, planning to stay 45 minutes. A few people smiled. The room settled. "My ex-husband was there," she said, "and he did what he'd been doing for 7 years, which was use a public space to remind me of his version of who I was." She paused. He was very good at it. He'd had years of practice. And what made it effective was not that I believed him. I didn't believe him, or I thought I didn't. It wasn't that by the time he was doing it in that ballroom, he'd been saying the same things in private for so long that I'd started using his voice when I thought about myself. The room was very quiet. "I know some of you know what that sounds like," she said. "The other person's voice in your head that you can't quite turn off. The one that shows up before a job interview, or on a first date, or in the middle of the night when you're doing the math on your savings account. The one that says you're too much and not enough at the same time, and you'd better be grateful for whatever you've got, because that's probably all you're going to get." She paused. "I had that voice for 4 years after the divorce," she said. "I did a lot of work to get quieter. I went to therapy. I built a life I was proud of. I made it small enough to be manageable, and I told myself that was wisdom rather than fear." She stopped. "And then I stood in a ballroom in October, and I heard the voice come back loud enough to cover everything else, and I had a choice." She looked at the room. "What I know now," she said, "that I didn't know 4 years ago, is that the voice doesn't go away because you argue with it. It goes away because you replace it. You find out what's actually true, not what someone else decided was true about you, not the story they told that became the story you told yourself. The actual truth, which requires being in rooms where people treat you like the truth matters." She paused. "And sometimes it requires being willing to stay in a room that scares you long enough to find out what you're made of." She looked at Roman briefly. He was looking back at her, steadily, quietly, the way he always did. Not proud the way someone takes credit. Proud the way someone watches something they love do what it was always capable of. My divorce wasn't the worst thing that ever happened to me, she said. It was the beginning of finding out who I was without someone else's version of me in the way. She paused. That took longer than I wanted it to. It was harder than I expected. And I am not going to stand here and tell you it ended in a neat resolution, because real things don't end that way. She looked at the room. But I'm standing here, and I know what my voice sounds like now, and that's mine. Nobody gave it to me, and nobody can take it. She stopped. The room erupted. Not the polite, dutiful applause of a charity event. The real kind, the kind that starts before people have decided to do it, that comes from somewhere, that isn't performed. Caroline was on her feet before most of the table. Lillian looked at her cousin's face, the full, uncomplicated pride of someone who had been watching a person fight their way back to themselves, and was now seeing them fully arrived. Lillian stood at the front of the room and held it. She didn't look at the floor. She didn't deflect. She stood in it, the way she'd been learning to stand in things directly, without apology, taking up the exact space she was entitled to. Later, after the dinner had wound down, and the room was emptying into the December night, Lillian found herself at the edge of the terrace, a different terrace from a different hotel, but terraces in Manhattan had the same relationship to the city's lights, the same quality of being between the inside and the sky. Roman found her there. He came to stand beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and looked out at the city for a moment before he said anything. "How do you feel?" he said. "Tired," she said. "The good kind." He nodded. "The program," he said. "What you built for tonight. The structure of it, the speakers you chose, the way you arranged it, it worked." "I know," she said. Not arrogant. "Just true," Rachel said, and I'm quoting her directly, "that you were the most difficult person she'd ever worked with, and also that she hopes you're involved again next year." Lillian almost smiled. "That sounds about right." He turned to look at her. The city was behind him, Manhattan's usual indifferent splendor, and his face in the ambient light was the face she'd been learning, over 2 months, the particular lines ends of it. The way it carried the weight of who he was without either apologizing or performing. "I want to say something," he said. "Say it," she said. "What you said in there," he said, "about the voice, about replacing it." He paused. "I've been running an organization that required me to maintain a certain version of myself, the one that was feared, the one that was known as dangerous, the one that the room shifted for. When I walked into it," he stopped. "I told myself that version was necessary, that it was just the operational reality of the environment I was in." He held her gaze. "I don't think I knew it was possible to want to be known differently until I watched someone do it in real time." She looked at him. "Are you saying I inspired you?" she said. "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that I am in the process of becoming something I hadn't decided to become until recently, and that you are a significant reason for the direction." She held that. "That's a lot of responsibility," she said. "I'm not putting it on you," he said. "I'm telling you what's true. You asked for the truth." "I did," she said. "Then that's it," he said. "The truth." She looked at the city for a moment. Somewhere below and across, in the regular geography of other people's lives, Graham Calloway was in the process of understanding what consequences felt like when they were actually attached to him. Vivian Mercer had taken a position in Boston, according to something Caroline had mentioned in passings, and seemed to be managing. Carter was navigating his terms. Webb was in a federal facility in New Jersey, spending considerable time regretting the specific decisions that had seemed so manageable from the inside. The case was nearly closed. The restructuring of the Blackwood organization was underway, smaller, cleaner, more legally defensible, a process that Roman had described to her as both painful and overdue, and she believed both. The foundation work had already changed shape since she'd been looking at it. She'd found 3 curriculum gaps in the adult literacy programs and had written recommendations that Roman had sent to the program directors with a note that was, from what she could tell, more directive than advisory. She had a meeting with the full program team in January. She was going to make Rachel's life complicated again, and she was comfortable with that. The ring was on her finger. It had been there for 2 months now. Turned to Roman. "The foundation meeting in January," she said. "Yes. I want to bring 2 colleagues from the school," she said. "Teachers who've been working in underserved districts for longer than I have. Their perspective on the program gaps is more complete than mine." "Set it up," he said. "Whatever you need. And I want it in the contract," she said. "My role with the foundation. Defined, documented, with my authority over the educational programming clearly articulated. Not because I don't trust you, because I don't operate on trust without structure. He looked at her. You want it in writing, he said. I want it in writing, she said. All right, he said. And Roman, she held his gaze. When the restructuring is done, when the parts that you said needed to change have actually changed, I want to see the paperwork. Not because I'm auditing you, because you told me the line existed and I need to know when you've reached it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not the controlled neutrality she'd seen in crisis, not the careful patience she'd seen in uncertainty. Something else. Something that looked, in the December night light of a Manhattan terrace, like a man who had been offered the specific thing he'd needed and was letting himself actually receive it. When the restructuring is done, he said, you'll be the first person I show. She nodded. She turned back to the city. He turned back to the city. They stood on the terrace in the quiet of the December night, a sound like green wood splitting, and the space between them was the particular comfortable space two people something hard together and arrived on the other side of it, knowing each other in a way that requires the hard thing to earn. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. The first time, she said. The fundraiser. When I argued with the speaker about the education funding, you stayed after. You listened to the whole argument. Yes, he said. And then you asked 2 questions, she said. I've been trying to remember what they were. I remember you asked them, and I remember they were specific, but I don't. I asked which schools had been passed over specifically, he said. And I asked whether the gap was a resource allocation problem or a decision-making problem. She looked at him. You remembered word for word. Yes, he said. Why those 2 questions? Because the answer to the first told me the scale, he said, and the answer to the second told me whether it could actually be fixed. She thought about that. What were my answers? 3 schools, he said. And you said it was a decision-making problem. You said the resources existed. They were just being directed by people who'd never set foot in the schools they were directing them away from. He paused. You were right, and you were angry about it in a way that was specific, not general outrage, the specific anger of someone who has been in those rooms. I had been in those rooms, she said. I know, he said. That's why I remembered. She was quiet for a moment. Below them, a cab honked once and was answered by nothing. A couple came out of the hotel's side entrance, laughing about something private. The city continued its work. I need to tell you something, Lillian said. He waited. When Graham put the ring on my finger, she stopped, corrected herself. When you put the ring on my finger, the first thing I felt wasn't surprise. He looked at her. It was, she found the word, relief, which I have been trying to make sense of for 2 months because I hadn't met you yet properly. I didn't know who you were, but the ring went on and I felt she stopped again. Like something I hadn't known I was holding let go. He was very still. I didn't want to tell you that, she said, because it sounds like the thing a person says when they're trying to explain a bad decision in a way that's like, it's like destiny. And I'm not doing that. I'm not saying it was meant to be or any of those. She shook her head. I'm saying that my body knew something my brain needed 2 months to catch up to. And my brain has now caught up. And I wanted you to know. Roman looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not as a statement. Just took it, his hand around hers. Steady and warm. The way someone holds something they intend to hold carefully. She let him. They stood there like that for a while, not speaking, not needing to. The city below them, and the December cold around them, and the evening winding down behind the terrace doors, and everything that was going to happen next, still being assembled somewhere just out of sight. The ring was always real, he said finally. I know, she said. I want you to know that everything attached to it, he said. What I said in that ballroom, it wasn't a performance. It was the first completely honest thing I'd done in a long time. She squeezed his hand once. I know that too, she said. They went back inside. The ballroom was mostly empty. Now, staff clearing tables, the events team managing the end of the evening with the efficient quiet of people who did this professionally. Rachel appeared briefly, caught Lillian's eye, gave her a look that contained both exhaustion and genuine respect, and disappeared again. Caroline intercepted them near the exit. Derek in tow. Caroline's eyes bright with the particular light of a woman who had spent the last 2 months watching something she'd hoped for arrive exactly as she'd hoped for it. You were extraordinary, Caroline said to Lillian. She said it directly, without preamble or performance. Thank you for calling him, Lillian said. Caroline looked at her, then at Roman, then back at Lillian. I called him because I was worried about you, Caroline said. What happened after that? She gestured at the ring, at Roman, at the general improbability of the whole situation. I take partial credit and full delight. Derek shook Roman's hand with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a man who found everything about the situation interesting and had no complicated feelings to process about it. Roman bore this with good grace. Lillian watched him do it the way he adjusted his manner to the person in front of him, not performing warmth exactly, but not withholding it either. She filed that. She filed a lot of things about him. Outside the hotel, the December night was cold enough to matter. The doorman brought Lillian's coat and she put it on, and the car was at the curb. Roman opened the door and she got in and he got in beside her, and the city moved around them the same way it always did, indifferent and brilliant and permanent. Brooklyn, she said to the driver. Yes, ma'am, the driver said. Roman looked at her. Brooklyn, he repeated. I'm going home, she said. To my apartment. My kitchen table. My grammar diagram on the whiteboard. I know, he said. I didn't say anything. You made a face. I didn't make a face. You made a face, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I was going to ask, he said carefully, whether you wanted company. She looked at him. The townhouse is 15 minutes in the other direction, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at the ring. Ask me in January, she said. After the foundation meeting. After I've seen the paperwork from the restructuring. She held his gaze. Me then. He looked at her steadily. January, he said. January, she said. And Roman. The answer is probably going to be yes. But I need the time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been waiting 3 years. January is manageable. She looked at him. He looked back. The car moved through the Brooklyn Bridge's lights, the cables and the towers, and the dark water below, the specific passage between two places that had always felt, to Lillian, like crossing into something more real. Manhattan behind them. Brooklyn ahead. Her apartment, her table, the ring on her finger, the lesson she'd already planned for Monday, and the foundation meeting, and the long, imperfect, genuinely promising thing taking shape. The car stopped outside her building. She turned to him before she got out. Good night, Roman, she said. Good night, Lillian, he said. She got out. She walked to her building. She didn't look back, not because she was making a point, but because she didn't need to. She knew he was there. She knew the car would wait until she was inside. She knew that in the morning she'd wake up in her own apartment with the ring on her nightstand or her finger. She hadn't decided yet, and she'd make her own coffee and plan her own Monday, and the day would be ordinary in all the ways she'd spent 4 years constructing, and also permanently different in the way that didn't announce itself. She went upstairs. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and looked at the whiteboard with its grammar diagram and thought about the woman who'd drawn it, the woman who rode subways in emerald dresses to rooms she was afraid of, who argued with strangers about education funding, who had spent 7 years being slowly told she was less than 4 years, learning the size of the lie, who had stood in a ballroom and found the right words under pressure, and then stood in front of a room of people 2 months later, and found them again, this time, without the pressure, just because they were true. She took the ring off, held it for a moment in her palm. It was warm from her hand. She set it on the table in the light. She looked at it for a while. Then she put it back on. This time she didn't tell herself it was because she didn't want to lose it. This time she just knew it was where it belonged. On her hand, in her life, in the story that was still being written, the one where nobody had decided the ending yet. And that was the right way for it to be two people taking their time, getting it right, building something that would stand, because they'd been careful about the foundation. Outside, a car engine turned over and pulled away from the curb. She heard it from the kitchen. She looked at the window, at the street below, ordinary and quiet. She picked up her mug. She drank her tea. She was still sitting there when the city reached the small hours, when the traffic thinned, and the night settled into itself. And the textured silence of Brooklyn in December came through the window glass like something you'd been waiting for. She wasn't afraid of the quiet anymore. She wasn't trying to fill it. She just sat in it, warm and steady and entirely herself, the ring on her finger and the lamp on the table, and everything that came next still out ahead of her, waiting to be lived.